The sun was a molten disk folding itself into the arms of the western hills. Its descent slow and ceremonious, as though reluctant to leave. The desert horizon shimmered in waves of orange and violet, and for a brief moment, the whole of the land seemed to hold its breath. Farmers paused mid-step, traders lowered their voices, and even the herons near the reed-clad riverbanks flew slower, wings trailing gold. For the ancient Egyptians, this was not just sunset, it was the unraveling of divine light, the opening of a gateway into another realm where Ra, the sun god, would sail his boat through the underworld. Clay homes with flat roofs began to glow softly, kissed by the last light of day. Children, moments ago laughing and running along the Nile's edge, now clustered near doorways, their sandals dusty, eyes wide and curious. The river itself, mighty and eternal, mirrored the changing sky, its surface turning from sapphire to burnished bronze. Fishermen brought in their nets, and boats docked with reverence, as if aware they were returning to land under the watchful eye of a dying god. In the temples of Thebes, Luxor and Memphis, priests began their dusk invocations. They moved through hypostyle halls with measured grace, their linen robes rustling like papyrus in wind. Candles were lit with sacred fire carried from midday altars. Incense of myrrh and kifi began to rise like ghostly tendrils, twining with shadow and curling around carved pillars that bore the stories of generations. Statues of gods stood watch, bathed in the orange hue, eyes carved from lapis and obsidian, seeming to shimmer in the half-light. Ordinary homes mirrored the temple, rhythms in humble ways. Women gathered dried reeds and twigs to light small fires in stone ovens, baking flatbreads laced with coriander and honey. The scent mingled with dust and river salt, drifting into the cooling air. Men returned from fields carrying baskets of leeks, onions, and figs, their shoulders taut from labor, but their steps slowed by the hush that came with nightfall. They spoke less now, not from weariness, but from reverence. Inside a modest courtyard, shaded by date palms, a grandmother placed a clay pot beneath the fig tree, whispering a prayer for protection. Around her, younger children arranged smooth stones in a circle and traced shapes in the dirt, half play, half invocation. They had been taught that twilight belonged not just to the living, but to spirits, to ancestors, and to the wandering gods who slipped between realms during this precious hour. A soft breeze stirred the linen curtains hanging in low windows, lifting them like breath. Within, the walls were painted in ochres and faded blues, scenes of the afterlife, of sacred animals and divine harvests. Every painted figure seemed to exhale as the light passed over them, as if awakening from slumber, to witness the turning of day into night. In such homes, nothing was mundane. Even shadow was sacred. Torches were kindled, but kept low. Their light was a companion, not a rival to the dusk. They flickered along stone walkways, through narrow alleys, casting long silhouettes of people moving slowly, respectfully. These flames, drawn from temple coals or household hearths, were said to carry the echo of Ra's fire, his warmth, his protection, now shared in smaller, flickering fragments across the land. Along the edge of the desert, near the and crumbled tombs, jackals began to stir. Their silhouettes moved like myths, golden-eyed and silent. Egyptians saw them not as threats, but as signs, the watchers of the dead, the messengers of Anubis. When they cried out, it was not fear they brought, but remembrance. The reminder that night was the domain of spirits and the soul's long passage. In wealthier homes, the sunset ritual became ceremony. Roofs were cleared and swept, and mats, laid out facing west. Incense was lit in bronze burners, and servants brought cool water from underground clay jars. Heads of households stood with arms raised to the heavens, whispering thanks for another day survived, another day guided by the gods. Their voices merged with the hush of wind, forming a lullaby for the sun. A scribe in a small study dipped his reed into a pot of dark ink, writing by the last streak of light filtering through a slit window. His tablet bore prayers of protection, poems to Thoth, and verses about dreams yet to come. As he wrote, his fingers trembled slightly, not from age, but from the electric stillness that always arrived with the fall of the horizon. He knew the veil was thinning. On a quiet bank by the Nile, an old woman crouched beside a faded shriner, rough stone with symbols etched long ago by her grandfather. She placed a date and a cup of beer at its base, bowing her head. This was her daily rite, unbroken for decades. She believed that her ancestors walked among her during twilight. touching her shoulder with fingers made of dusk and memory. Meanwhile, in the city's heart, torches glowed in long rows along main streets, forming a fiery spine that guided travelers home. Merchants pulled down their woven canopies, and guards tightened their belts, preparing for the darker watch. Yet none rushed. Night was not an enemy. It was a second life, strange, luminous, filled with omens. In Egypt, night was a sacred text, read differently by each soul. A young mother rocked her infant in a linen wrap, singing softly in a language older than pyramids. Her lullaby echoed a hymn once spoken by temple priestesses, words asking Hathor to watch the child's dreams, to keep his soul whole as it left his body in sleep and returned with the light. She moved in rhythm with the world, swaying. As the sky deepened into indigo, far from the bustle, a farmer stood alone on a dune, facing the setting sun. His silhouette cut a lean, noble figure against the blood-orange sky. In his hand, he held a lotus flower half-bloomed. He placed it on the ground, then crossed his arms over his chest in the gesture of Osiris. A silent prayer passed through him like wind, to wake again, to see another sunrise, to earn another day. The pyramids, vast and eternal, cast immense shadows now. Their sides caught the last gleam of Ra's journey, glowing gold and then fading to ash. At their feet, tombs whispered to one another through sand-filled corridors. The dead, too, watched the sun set, their journey mimicking his, sailing through the night toward resurrection. A crocodile drifted through the Nile's current like a relic from the time of gods. Its eyes gleamed just above water as it passed. Beneath a cluster of lilies nearby, a young priestess lit a lamp and set it afloat, her lips murmuring a prayer for the protection of her village. The flame bobbed, weaving through reflections of the first stars, a flickering eye watching the sky. Birds that had sung all day now grew silent, replaced by the songs of frogs, insects, and distant flutes. Music was part of the dimming note, a thread in the night's great tapestry. Young men played reed flutes from rooftops, blending their music with the rustle of wind and the hum of water wheels. The land, alive all day, now began to dream. The gods, it was believed, walked among them now. They were not bound to statues, but moved freely through fields and homes, drawn by incense and sincerity. If one listened closely, they might hear soft footsteps behind them, or feel the air shift around their skin. Those moments were not feared, they were honored. Presence was not always visible. A potter paused beside his kiln, the glow within rivaling the sun's retreat. He stared at the cooling sky and whispered to Pata, patron of craftsmen. His hands, stained with clay, were folded in front of him. His wheel was still. The vessel inside the kiln would harden overnight, shaped by heat and time, much like the soul under the pressures of the unseen night. Within one of the great temples, a priest knelt before a statue of Isis. He did not speak. Instead, he listened to the silence, to the hush within stone halls, to the heartbeat of the divine. His oil lamp cast shadows that danced like wings, and he imagined her arms extending around all who prepared to surrender to sleep. And in every corner of Egypt's city, village, desert, and floodplain, the people turned inward. Their eyes looked toward flame, toward stars, toward the memory of Ra and the promise of his return. They understood that night was not the opposite of life, but its mirror. In the dimming horizon, they saw themselves small, radiant, and utterly sacred. In the final hour before full darkness, homes across Egypt pulsed with a soft, living stillness. The day had passed, labor had ceased, and now came the sacred interlude, when hunger was soothed, not only with food, but with presence. The last meal was rarely a grand feast, but it was always deliberate. It was a moment of grounding, of drawing breath and breaking bread, not in haste, but in communion. The ancient Egyptians understood that what was eaten before sleep nourished not just the body, but the spirit as it prepared to cross into the dream world. In the courtyards and open kitchens of village homes, mothers ladled lentil stew into clay bowls, each movement a rhythm learned from generations. Children fetched small stacks of warm barley bread from stone ovens, the loaves still steaming, their scent mingling with crushed garlic and caraway. Fathers, freshly returned from the fields or workshops, washed their hands in silence, not out of ritual alone but out of respect for what was about to be shared. Food as remembrance, food as offering. Figs and dates were arranged on shallow plates, alongside wedges of goat cheese and chopped green onions. Where meat was rare, the evening meal leaned on the richness of grains. pulses, and herbs. In more fortunate households, roast duck or salted fish added depth to the meal's aroma. Yet regardless of wealth, what mattered most was the mood. The deliberate, quiet, the slow chewing, the eyes cast downward or gently closed as the mouth tasted the last flavors of the day. No one shouted during this meal. Voices were lowered, laughter was rare, and interruptions were considered impolite, even disrespectful. Elders often led the meal with a brief utterance words, invoking Hathor for sweetness, or Geb for bounty. Children watched in silence, learning through observation how reverence could sit beside simplicity. There were no elaborate table settings, no elaborate displays. The sacredness came from presence, not decoration. In temples, priests broke their evening fast with ritualized simplicity. A small offering perhaps, a sliver of honeyed cake, a sip of pomegranate wine was consumed before the larger communal meal. This minor bite was not for sustenance but for sanctification. The priest did not eat for hunger alone, but to seal a covenant with the divine, a mutual agreement between gods and mortals that life would continue, even through the obscurity of night. Among common folk, the family dog might sit patiently near the mat, waiting for scraps, while cats slinked along the edges, their eyes reflecting torchlight like jewels. But even these creatures were quieter now, as if they too felt the shift in the air. For the ancient Egyptian night was not simply the absence of light, it was a presence, a watchful, hovering spirit. And in that presence, one did not act without thought. Some families ate indoors, the cool stone walls surrounding them like ancient arms. Others chose to sit beneath the open sky, where the first stars began to prick through the darkness. These outdoor meals felt especially spiritual. The crunch of bread, the sigh of contentment after a sip of beer, the rustle of linen robes shifting on woven mats, all of it under the gaze of constellations, some of which had names older than the pharaohs. The father might glance at his son and offer him the last portion of beans, nodding without speaking. The mother might place an extra fig into her daughter's hand and lightly brush the child's hair back from her brow. These gestures, small, almost imperceptible, carried entire histories. For Egyptians, care was never loud. It was slow, intentional, like carving a name into stone. As the meal drew to a close, cups were refilled, not with excitement, but with rhythm. Beer made from dates or emmer grain was poured slowly into each vessel. Some families passed around a shared cup, sipping in turns. It was less about thirst and more about continuity. Each sip acknowledged the day's end, as though drinking a blessing passed from one mouth to another. In moments like these, time loosened. The world seemed to stretch, suspended between the flame of a torch and the shimmer of Sirius in the sky. Even the wind softened, becoming less of a force and more of a lullaby. Children leaned against their mothers, blinking slower. Grandparents whispered stories, half prayer, half memory, about gods who once walked through lotus fields, or birds who spoke prophecy in dreams. When the eating was finished, the remnants were not discarded carelessly. Bones were buried near fig trees, crumbs swept into small baskets and offered to animals or burned. Leftovers were not viewed as trash, but as sacred echoes of the meal itself. Even the smallest piece had absorbed something of the family's breath, their warmth, their attention. To waste it would be to forget the gods who made grain grow. Afterward, bowls were rinsed with cool water drawn from sealed jugs. The sound of water splashing against clay was the only noise in some homes. Women wiped the stone surfaces with linen cloths, their movements unhurried. Daughters helped mothers stack utensils carefully, returning them to shelves made of mud brick and wood. The rhythm of these gestures was as ancient as the Nile. And then came the true silence, not the silence of absence, but of fullness. Bellies, warm skin cooled by night air. Families leaned back against cushions or lay side by side on mats, letting their eyes close without fully surrendering to sleep. It was a liminal time. Thoughts wandered gently toward ancestors, toward gods, toward the soft question of whether one would dream tonight, and if so, what the dream would say. Men sometimes spoke in whispers, reciting lines from poems or maxims learned in their youth. As the stars return, so may your soul, one might murmur. Another might respond with, as Ra sails the underworld, so may we return renewed. These exchanges were not declarations, they were reminders, like stepping stones placed across the threshold of the dark. Within wealthier households, the post-meal hour included readings from scrolls or small ritual performances. A musician might play the lute or softly tap a drum while incense was burned in bowls carved with protective deities. Children would be lulled to sleep by the music and the scent, while adults kept vigil a little longer, eyes flickering with the light of distant flames. For the poor, who had no scrolls or musicians, the night sang its own song. The rustling of date palms, the chirping of crickets, and the soft crunch of sandals on sand were enough. Silence, after all, was the richest music of all in Egypt. It was considered the sound of Mat in perfect balance, a space where gods could step quietly among mortals and listen to their hearts. In some homes, after the meal, one member would sprinkle a few drops of water at the doorway, an invitation for benevolent spirits to enter, or a boundary against wandering ones. These rituals varied from home to home, passed through bloodlines like lullabies. The action was simple, but the meaning was vast. Welcome and ward, opening and guarding, trust and caution. As the moon climbed higher, its light silvered rooftops, and cast long shadows from palm trunks and temple obelisks. In that light, the silence deepened. The voices of the day market calls, hammer strikes, laughter were long gone. What remained was the slow echo of presence, of breathing, of being. Couples, lying side by side, sometimes reached for each other, not for passion, but for grounding. A hand on a shoulder, a breath against a neck. It was a final confirmation. I am here, and you are here, and we are still in this world together. And when we sleep, may we travel the unseen places side by side, in the darkened corners of rooms, near altars, or beneath shelves of figurines. Tiny offerings from the meal might be place crumbs of bread, a single drop of beer, or a fig cut in half. These were for the gods and the dead, who did not need large gifts, only remembrance. It was said that even a taste, offered with sincerity, could reach across the veil and nourish a soul. Even slaves and servants, when permitted to eat in peace, followed the same rhythms. Though their food was plainer, though their hands more calloused, the silence that followed their meal was just as sacred. It wrapped around them like linen, like smoke, like sleep. And when all mouths were still, and all flames burned low, the land of Egypt exhaled. The last meal had tethered each soul gently to the earth, offering warmth before the plunge into dreams. Night had arrived, not as a thief, but as a guest, and across the kingdom, silence settled like dust, soft, ancient, and holy. When the last crumbs had been cleared and silence settled into the crevices of the home, the time came for water to do its ancient work. In a world where sweat was constant and dust clung to every limb, the washing ritual was more than practical, it was spiritual. Water pulled from earthen jars or fetched from nearby wells, shimmered in bowls like captured moonlight. It held within it not only the promise of cleanliness, but renewal. Each ripple whispered of rebirth, as if the Nile itself had sent fragments of its sacred flow into every household basin. Women began the ritual with quiet care, cupping water into their hands, letting it fall gently across their cheeks, their feet, their forearms. The water trickled down sun-kissed skin like a soft breath, lifting the weight of the day's toil. It was not rushed. Every movement was deliberate, every drop a cleansing of effort, of worry, of sunburn and labor. In these moments, time thickened, slowed, and held each person in a sacred pause between what had been and what was still to come. Children were first to be washed. Mothers knelt beside low basins, using pomphaba cloths to wipe away the grime of play and earth. Little feet were scrubbed, hair smoothed with damp fingers. The children giggled softly, but even their laughter was subdued. They knew this was no ordinary bath. This was preparation for dreams, for the journey through the night where the body rested but the soul wandered far. Fathers washed their hands and faces, dipping from a shared vessel and drying with linen strips. The motion was always the same, from forehead to chin, from wrist to elbow. In each repetition lived an echo of the ancient priests who washed in this same way before entering the temples of Ra or Osiris, though not everyone spoke of it. The body was regarded as a vessel for the divine, and water was the threshold that re-sanctified it for the night. The basins themselves, whether of carved stone, copper, or simple clay, were treated with a respect close to reverence. They were cleaned after use, polished, refilled. Some households placed them near icon small, painted figures of base Isis or Hathor, acknowledging that this was more than hygiene. It was a gift to the self. and to the unseen watchers who moved through the house once shadows thickened. In larger homes, servants helped the noblewomen unwind their braids and dab perfumed water behind their ears. Buckets were heated over coals and poured carefully into alabaster tubs. Fragrant herbs, thyme, marjoram, lotus petals floated on the surface. As the women bathed, their voices dropped to whispers, telling stories, recalling dreams from the night before. It was not idle talk, it was a continuation of ritual, an exchange of visions under the gaze of the stars. The act of washing was a signal to the gods. I am ready. Ready for sleep, for guidance, for the safe departure of the BA into the land of shadows. Just as the body of a mummy was ritually bathed before burial, so too was the living body bathed before sleep. The difference was only in permanence. Both entered a place beyond the known, and both required purity to be received with grace. In the quiet corners of temples, priests immersed their hands in sacred pools, carved deep into stone courtyards. These waters were believed to be charged with the breath of the gods. With every wash, the priests murmured invocations, sometimes under their breath, sometimes in full chant. The air shimmered with incense, and the sound of dripping water echoed like memory through the great stone halls. Some would cleanse not only their skin, but their possessions. Amulets were rubbed with water and then dried with linen. Symbols were wiped clean, the eye of Horus on a wooden bowl, the ankh painted above a doorway. This was not superstition but dialogue. Washing was a form of acknowledgement, a whisper to the divine. You are still here. I remember. The elderly, their joints stiff with time, moved slowly through the ritual. They sat on stone stools, their hands cradled in warm water by younger kin. Wrinkles caught the droplets, holding them for a moment before releasing them like rain off old bark. These elders sometimes closed their eyes, remembering years when they had washed their own parents, or been washed as children. The cycle repeated. The water bore witness to it all. In poorer homes, the water may have been scarce, but the ritual endured. Even a single cup was used with intention. A cloth dipped, wrung out, passed across the forehead. This was enough. The gods, it was believed, did not measure by abundance but by attention. Sincerity weighed heavier than silver, and one drop of water, offered in humility, was worth rivers. Bathing spaces were often lit with oil lamps, their flames casting long shadows on plastered walls. As the water moved over skin, the flicker of light danced across muscles and faces, revealing the vulnerability and beauty of those moments. In this light, every scar, every mark of labor, became sacred, a testament to a day survived, a life unfolding. Occasionally, the washing was accompanied by song, not always lyrics with meaning, but simple melodies hummed, remembered from childhood, passed down through lullabies. These songs filled the spaces between gestures, carrying the rhythm of hands moving over backs, of water being poured, of breath slowing into peace. The act of washing also marked a psychic shift. No longer were people of the day, now they were pilgrims of the night, ready to surrender, control, and enter the floating silence of dreams. In washing, one let go of the burdens clinging invisibly to the skin, an argument, a regret, a sorrow. They were washed away like dust from sandals. Even animals, especially sacred ones, were often given their own form of ritual cleansing. Cats, birds, and even monkeys were brushed or lightly dabbed with cool water. In temples, crocodiles and ibises, associated with divine symbols, were cleansed with priestly hands. The animals, too, carried the breath of the gods within them. Once clean, the freshly bathed would often sit in stillness, letting the air dry their limbs. They sat cross-legged or reclined, wrapped in white linen, eyes half-lidded, listening to the night. No rush to dress, no rush to speak, just breath and silence, as if waiting for a signal from the stars that it was safe now to close the eyes and drift. Sometimes, dreams would begin even before sleep. A flicker of vision behind the eyes, a garden, a serpent, a voice calling a name long forgotten. These moments were welcomed, not feared. They were signs that the barrier between this world and the next had begun to thin, and that the soul was already stepping toward it. Clean and unburdened, young women might place perfume or oil behind their ears, along the collarbone, or at the base of the spine. These were not for others to notice, they were gestures of respect, of inner adornment. They believed the gods could smell purity, that spirits could be drawn towards sweetness and soothed by it. It was a language beyond words, A small jar of water might be left uncovered beside a bed, for the soul to sip upon returning. The bar, traveling beyond, would grow thirsty in the sands between realms. This was not symbolic, it was real. To them, a hospitality for the soul, as important as a blanket or a door left slightly open. And in the final moments before lying down, the cleansed would look upon their own hands, now damp and softened. They would trace lines on their palms, sometimes whispering a name of a lost loved one, of a protective deity, of the self. These names, spoken in the language of twilight, hung in the air like floating hieroglyphs that the water would eventually grow still. The basins emptied, the cloths wrung out, the jars capped. But the feeling remained as skin cooled by divinity, a body reset, a spirit lighter. And as the household dimmed, as breath began to deepen, one truth lingered in every soul. The gods had been near, and had touched them with water. And so, Egypt bathed its body in preparation, not for sleep alone, but for the descent into unseen rivers. The waters of cleansing had carried away the grit of day. And now, barefoot and silent, the people approached the threshold of dreams. When the washing was complete, and the air clung soft and cool to newly cleansed limbs, the next ritual unfolded, anointing the body with sacred scent. In Egypt, scent was not indulgence. It was memory, it was magic, it was a whispered language, between mortal and divine. The oils were kept in small alabaster flasks, their curves worn smooth by generations of fingers. They held within them the distilled breath of sacred groves, the echo of temple gardens, and the volatile soul of blossoms that bloomed for only hours beneath the desert sun. Lotus oil was among the most beloved. Thick and golden, it clung to the skin like sunlight and left behind a trail of watery sweetness. The scent was both feminine and immortal, favored by priestesses and noblewomen who wished to honor Hathor, goddess of love and music. Myrrh, darker and resinous, was used by elders and those who sought protection during sleep, its heaviness grounding the spirit and cloaking it in ancient warmth. These oils were often mixed with a carrier of animal fat or beeswax, then warmed slightly between palms before application. In humble homes, where precious oils were used sparingly, women and men still dabbed even a trace upon their necks or wrists. A drop was enough. It was not how much, but with what intent. The gods were not seduced by abundance, but by care. A woman might rub a fingertip over the rim of a jar, gather the faintest gloss, and press it gently onto her breastbone. She might close her eyes as she did so, not in vanity, but in reverence. To anoint oneself was to prepare the spirit for flight. Children were sometimes touched with a light trace of oil at the temples, behind the ears, at the base of the spine. It was believed that these were doorways through which dreams entered. A protective scent, especially kifi, the sacred incense blend of wine, honey, frankincense, and herbs, might keep away wandering spirits who preyed on the innocent. Mothers would hum softly as they touched their children, anchoring them with scent and song alike. Perfuming was also an act of remembrance. Many believed that the soul, upon leaving the body at night, would recognize the scent it wore and follow it back home. In tombs, oils were buried with the dead for this very reason, that the bar would not lose its way in the darkness between death and resurrection. In life, this belief translated into nightly rituals, repeated with devotion. Scent became a compass for the spirit. The act of applying the oil was slow, deliberate. One did not rush over the skin. It was rubbed into the joints, knees, elbows. The nape of the neck, each motion circular, rhythmic, like the turning of a wheel. Women rubbed it into their scalps, then twisted their hair into braids, binding the fragrance within. Men might massage their shoulders or chest, feeling the tension of the day melt beneath their own hands. There was power in self-touch, sovereignty, memory. In the high courts of pharaohs and nobles, perfumers were artists in their own right. They crafted custom blends. Scents meant not just to delight, but to mark identity. A queen might wear an oil so distinct that her arrival was known by aroma alone. Her presence lingered long after she left a room, as though the air itself carried her memory. Even in sleep, her sheets and pillow would hum with floral sweetness, creating a bed that was as much altar as resting place. The poor, with less access to costly ingredients, turned to the desert's own offerings. Crushed herbs, dried citrus peel, and marjoram were burned gently, then cooled and pressed into paste. These simple perfumes, rubbed into skin with reverence, were believed to carry just as much spiritual potency. A flower did not need a palace to be holy, nor did a body need wealth to be sacred. Sincerity was the true distillation. Before perfuming themselves, some would hold the open jar beneath their nose and breathe in deeply. This inhalation was a kind of offering to the lungs, to the blood, to the ancestors. It was said that smell was the sense most closely tied to memory, and that when one remembered through scent, they communed with the past. Grandmother's hands, lovers' necks, the breath of a newborn child, each lived again in a single whiff of oil. It was also believed that the gods could be drawn by scent. Just as food nourished the dead, perfume pleased the divine. Temples were thick with fragrance. Osiris was said to weep tears of frankincense. Anubis walked behind clouds of burning myrrh. So to perfume the body before nightfall was to call the gods gently toward one's home, to ask for their presence. Without demand, some wrapped cloth soaked in scented oil around their necks or wrists, letting the fragrance seep into their veins slowly. Others placed oil on their pillows, so the scent would rise with body heat and surround them as they drifted into sleep. These rituals were not born of vanity. They were born of longing for protection, for connection, for beauty in the invisible. Lovers often shared scents. A woman might leave her oil on her partner's collarbone, brushing it there with the back of her hand. A man might press his perfumed thumb to a lover's palm. These exchanges were wordless promises. When one turned in sleep, they would smell the other and know they were not alone. Even across distances, scent bridged the space between hearts. Perfume was also used to banish fear. Night held dangers physical and spiritual. To enter it anointed was to declare oneself prepared. The body, fragrant and glowing, became less vulnerable to curses, to bad dreams, to unseen watchers. It was wrapped in a cloak, invisible but potent, a moving incense offering, a light made not of flame, but aroma. In desert camps, where shelter was only cloth and stars, scent took on even greater meaning. Travelers rubbed their throats with cedar oil before sleep, believing it would steady their breath and soothe their dreams. Some mixed oil with sand, rubbed it into their calves to cool the fire of sunburn. These small acts were whispers of civilization. In the wild ritual drawn against vast, silent night, priests and healers sometimes anointed the sick with oils, not only for healing but for peace. When someone hovered near death, the final perfuming was sacred. It echoed the nightly rituals, reminding the body that rest was not an ending, but a threshold. For in Egypt, death and sleep were siblings, and both required sweet scent to be safe. There were stories of those who woke in the middle of the night and found their room filled with perfume. No oil had been spilled, no lamp lit. These people were said to have been visited by gods, by ancestors, by divine messengers. The scent lingered for hours, calming the heart, changing the dream. It was a blessing beyond language. Even infants were lightly perfumed, a fingertip of oil to the crown of the head, to the soles of the feet. The very young, who lived closest to the veil, were seen as especially vulnerable and especially blessed. Their scent was chosen carefully, often lotus or chamomile, chosen by the mother or midwife to match the spirit of the child. Perfuming was sometimes accompanied by recitations, small phrases, invocations to Mat, to protect the balance of the sleeper. May the winds carry only sweetness, one might say, or let the scent confuse the dark spirits and draw only light. These prayers were murmured while rubbing wrists or feet, making the ritual a blend of body and word. Over time, certain scents became linked with certain people. A father who wore frankincense every night, a sister who always smelled of crushed basil. When these people passed into the afterlife, their scent jars were sealed with them, placed close to their heads in tombs. It was said the gods would know them by smell, not just by name. During festivals, special perfumes were made and used only during sacred days. But the nightly anointing was more intimate. It was not spectacle, but tenderness. It was between the self and the divine. It was a private blessing, given with fingertips and breath. It made the act of sleep an act of devotion. By the time the anointing was complete, the home smelled not of cooking or bodies, but of gardens, of temples, of long-vanished rains. The air shimmered with warmth and promise, and as the oil soaked deeper into the skin, it did something more than protect it remembered. It held the story of the day, the shape of the body, the wishes of the soul. Some believed the scent lingered in dreams, that when one entered the dream realm, the fragrance followed, like a trail of stars across a dark sky, and that wherever the soul wandered, the gods could find them by it fragrant and glowing. The sleeper's spirit perfumed like a holy text. Even as sleep approached, the scent did not fade. It merged with the body's own rhythm, its breath, its pulse. The perfumed sleeper became a vessel of memory, a soft burning lamp in the dark. And as their eyes closed, and the last of the oil was rubbed gently into the soles of the feet, Egypt turned once more into a land of hushed beauty, where even scent was sacred. When the final flickers of torchlight surrendered to the deeper blue of night, and the scent of oil still lingered like memory on the skin, the Egyptian home began its quiet transformation. What was once a space of sound and motion, cooking, chatter, labor, and warmth now became a temple of stillness. The house itself, shaped by sun-baked bricks and painted plaster, drew inward, as if breathing slowly in its sleep. The door was bolted softly, curtains drawn. The flame in the main lamp lowered to a thread of light. The house of shadows had awakened. In this nighttime world, the walls whispered differently. They no longer held echoes of voices or clinking bowls, but hummed with the energy of unseen presences. The hieroglyphs carved into wooden beams and painted near altars seemed to shimmer faintly, not with light, but with memory. Everything within the home became both sanctuary and threshold. The boundaries between living and dead, between waking and dreaming, thinned like linen under moonlight. Those who stirred within moved softer, slower, aware of the space they now shared with the past. Flickering shadows danced across plaster, stretching into strange shapes. A mother's hand brushing her daughter's hair might cast the silhouette of a falcon's wing across the wall. A jug of water glinting in the lamplight might resemble a coiled cobra for one heartbeat before revealing itself again. The Egyptians did not fear such illusions. They believed the shadows were messengers, part of the Ka or soul, echoing in every corner. They were to be respected, not chased away. Beds were not always elaborate. Many slept on simple raised mats, or woven reeds placed along the floor. But the space around the bed was sacred. It was arranged with care. Amulets hung from nearby walls, often shaped like ankhs or protective eyes. Papyrus scrolls were sometimes tucked beneath pillows, containing blessings, hymns, or names of deities whose gaze shielded the soul. The sleeper was not alone. Even in stillness, they were watched by the loving eyes of ancestors and gods. A brazier might remain lit in a corner of the room, its coals faintly glowing red, not for heat, but to keep away what should not come. A bowl of salt or natron could sit near the door, purifying the space. Some households placed a figurine of Torat, the hippopotamus goddess of protection, beside the cradle or sleeping child. Her squat, maternal form was believed to guard the household from wandering spirits and nightmares. Silence was never absolute. In the house of shadows, the world whispered. Wind passed through slits in the walls. Reeds rustled near the door. A pot creaked as it cooled. These were the sounds of a home breathing. Egyptians listened for them not with anxiety, but attentiveness. If the night was too quiet, it could be unsettling. Life required movement, even subtle. Stillness without sound belonged to tombs, not homes. In dreams, the spirit was believed to rise from the body and travel. The boffin depicted as a human-headed bird would soar above cities and temples, visiting ancestors, gods, or distant lands. But for the body left behind, safety was vital. So families arranged the sleeping space like a protective circle. Heads pointed toward the east, in the direction of the rising sun, and thus rebirth. Feet toward the west, where Ra descended, carrying the dead through the duat doors were often marked with protective signs. A simple symbol scratched into the wood, a splash of ochre paint, a few drops of oil. These gestures were quiet and deliberate. They were not made with drama, but devotion. They marked the line between the world within and the world without, between sanctuary and chaos. The House of Shadows was safe because it was prepared, not through walls, but through attention. In this space, the relationship with the unseen deepened. The Egyptians believed that the dead could visit not to harm, but to observe, to offer warnings, to bless the living. A grandfather who had passed years ago might stand in the doorway, visible only to the child who stirred in sleep. A sister lost to fever might sit beside her brother's bed, her scent like lotus and river wind. These presences were not spoken of in daylight, but they were honored through ritual and stillness. Children often murmured in their dreams, their voices soft, filled with half-formed words. Parents listened. If a child cried out, it was not met with haste, but with a whispered name, a touch on the forehead, a few words from a protective hymn. Some mothers hummed melodies known only within the home, songs passed down through women's voices, each one imbued with invisible power. A lullaby, after all, was a spell cast with breath. Even pets sensed the shift. Cats curled tightly at the feet of their sleeping owners, tails twitching as though hunting in their own dreams. Dogs might lie with heads raised, eyes half closed, ears twitching at sounds only they could hear. They were not simply animals in the night, they were guardians, eyes between worlds. The Egyptians knew this and gave them space and silence. In wealthier homes, rooms were divided with thick linens, separating sleeping spaces. Behind one curtain, a mother and daughter might lie head to head. Behind another, an elder reciting prayers softly until sleep carried them off. The linens swayed slightly in the warm night breeze, mimicking the sails of Ra's boat as it journeyed through the duat. Each compartment of the home became a chamber of the soul. Outside, the streets had gone silent, only the occasional whisper of sandals over sand, or the soft howl of a jackal near the necropolis. In the House of Shadows, however, the world was alive. It breathed, remembered, watched. Each moment was layered, physical and spiritual. The body rested, the spirit wandered, the home protected, and the gods listened. A scribe, before retiring, might trace symbols into the sand near his door, symbols for protection, for quiet dreams, for memory. These would be swept away by morning wind, but the act mattered. In Egypt, intention was as strong as stone. To trace was to remember, to draw was to declare. Even the simplest mark could hold power if made with focused heart. Some homes held dream journals, scraps of pottery, or pieces of parchment where dreams were recorded. The dreams of the night were not random. They were signs, messages, invitations. A woman who dreamed of crocodiles might wake and speak with the village priest. A man who dreamt of open water might offer extra bread at the shrine the next day. The House of Shadows was also the house of dreams. Those who slept poorly might rearrange their bed, shift the direction of their head, or sleep with an amulet beneath their tongue. There were countless customs and small changes passed down through lineage, each said to ease the spirit's flight. Nothing was accidental in the house at night. Each object, each gesture, each breath served a purpose. Before sleeping, many households recited prayers to the stars. These were not loud or dramatic. A single line murmured while facing a window. A name of a god whispered before turning to one side. The words floated into the dark like thin strands of incense, rising into the sky, carried upward by silence itself. Prayer was not speech, was presence. The home became a body. Its walls were ribs, its hearth a beating heart, its door a mouth sealed against danger. The family became cells within it, alive, glowing, protected. The House of Shadows was more than shelter. It was a vessel sailing slowly through the sea of night, carrying its dreaming passengers toward the rising shore of Radot outside. A priest might still chant in a distant temple, his voice barely reaching the rooftops. That murmur, carried by wind, wrapped around sleeping homes like a second skin. The chant was for Matt, for balance, for the orderly turning of time. It reminded the world that even in shadow, the divine was near. Some believed that during sleep, one could be judged in miniature tiny tests presented through dream. If one's heart was light, the dreams would be clear and gentle. If one had erred, the dreams would thicken with confusion. The House of Shadows thus became a courtroom of the soul, where one's truest thoughts unfolded beyond waking memory. And yet, despite the depth of belief, the House of Shadows was never heavy with fear. It was gentle, protective. The night was not enemy, but elder. It asked for quiet, not panic, for awareness, not dread. It was a time to return to oneself, to re-enter the oldest language, the silence beneath all things, beneath all things. As the moon climbed high, and the stars wheeled over the desert, Egypt slept, but her homes remained alert in stillness. They were vessels of faith, of story, of memory, and within each, a sleeper dreamed, bathed in oil, wrapped in linen, protected by shadows. And in the deepest hour of night, even the gods leaned close to listen. The House of Shadows held them all, body, soul, and breath. A floating island in the great sea of night, glowing with the soft light of reverence. Before the final stretch of night fully enveloped the Nile, before the stars arranged themselves like divine eyes overhead. There was one more task left for those who lived with reverence. The home, now cooled and silent, became a sacred vessel. For a final gesture of gratitude, the offerings. It was a moment where the lines between the seen and unseen melted entirely. A date pressed into a dish, a sliver of bread, a smear of honey left atop a shard of painted pottery. These were not gifts of grandeur, but of love. The gods did not hunger for volume, they listened to intention. Even the poorest households made space for this. A woman might slice her last fig in half and place it on the windowsill, eyes closed, murmuring a name known only to her heart. A boy might crumble his leftover bread and scatter it near the entrance, whispering thanks to Bass for his protection. Every act was deliberate. The food was not waste. It had been part of the day's breath and labor, and now it passed into the mouth of the divine. In silence and smoke and stillness, in corner shrines carved into mud brick or shaped from limestone, statuettes stood watch. Hathor with her cow horns, Isis with her throne-shaped crown, Anubis with his jackal face. They did not blink, but their presence was felt. A father would light a pinch of incense before these figures, its smoke twining upward like spirit language. The scent wasn't just perfume, it was prayer, rising like breath to where only the gods could fully inhale. Offerings often mirrored the day's meals, a portion of lentils, a spoonful of stew, a few drops of beer. These were placed with care in tiny bowls that rarely left the shrine. Some were passed from generation to generation, the clay worn smooth by the touch of hundreds of twilight hands. It wasn't the food that mattered, it was the memory soaked into it. Each offering was a moment and acknowledgement that the gods had walked beside the household, even if unseen. Children participated, their hands small and clumsy, but no less sacred. A mother would guide her daughter's palm, helping her sprinkle salt before the household deity. A son might be asked to light a wick soaked in oil, his eyes wide with the glow of fire. In these rituals, they learned the rhythm of gratitude, not through command, but through repetition. To offer was not a chore, but a joy, a habit of love, a nightly whisper that said, "I see you, and thank you." In temples, offerings were more elaborate. Priests in white linen processed through chambers with trays of fruit, bread stacked in spirals, flowers bound with rushes. But in the home, the intimacy was deeper. The god was not separate. They sat in the corner, watched from the lint flickered in the flame. The offerings were not performances, they were conversations. Soft, quiet, utterly sincere. Some offered spoken words, a line from the hymn to Amen, a verse honoring Ra's passage through the underworld. But many said nothing at all. They would stand still after placing their offering, bowing slightly, not from fear, but from reverence. The silence itself was the gift. The stillness, the presence, the unwavering attention in a world that rarely allowed pause. This was the true sacrifice. Each night, the offerings took on a new meaning. On days of sorrow, they were an appeal. On days of joy, a celebration. On days of fear, a plea for protection. The gods were not static. They responded, it was believed, to the changing tides of the human heart. And so, the offerings became a language of mood, an expression of the unspoken interior life of a family. Some women, before placing the food, touched it briefly to their lips, not to taste, but to bless. Their breath, their life, passed into the gift. It was believed this transferred the essence of the household to the gods. It made the offering more than food. It became soul, breath and grain, memory and sweetness, all joined together. Occasionally, the offerings included flowers, lotus petals plucked at dusk, still damp from the canal, papyrus stems tied with rush thread. These were placed beside the food, their scent meant to please the gods. The flowers would wilt by morning, but that did not matter. Their beauty had already been seen by unseen eyes. Their colors had already shimmered in the darkness between realms. There was no uniformity. Some families placed their offerings at the doorway, believing it would please protective spirits as they passed by. Others left them on rooftops, closer to the sky, hoping the gods would reach them more easily. In certain regions, the offerings were set near wells or water jars, as water was life, and life flowed back to the gods. It was said that rejected offerings turned sour by morning, infested with ants or spoiled unnaturally fast. But accepted offerings faded sweetly, their remnants, bearing the soft scent of peace, Some priests taught that a clean, undisturbed offering was a sign that the gods had received it without disturbance, that the home was balanced, the air clear. Even the act of preparing the offering held power. Some women reserved a bit of each ingredient while cooking, setting it aside long before the meal was served. That piece, untouched by hunger or fingers, would be kept for the divine. It wasn't always grand. A single olive, a spoon of beans, a crust of bread, but it had been reserved, and that made it sacred. Offerings were sometimes left for the dead as well. Small bowls placed near the family tomb or at household altars that honored ancestors. It was believed the spirits of the dead could partake in the essence of the food, rejoining the living in quiet communion. During festival nights, especially the beautiful Feast of the Valley, these offerings multiplied meals set out in full, candles lit, doors left ajar for the visiting souls. A single jug of cool water, capped with a linen cloth, might sit beside the offering. It was for the gods to drink, for the dead to taste, or even for the bar of the dreamer, should it return thirsty. In this world, generosity was never wasted. Even water carried meaning. It quenched more than thirst, it refreshed memory, washed away regret, renewed bonds older than stone. Sometimes, the offering became a place of prayer. A woman might lean over the small altar and whisper her fears. A father might touch the side of the shrine and think of his aging mother. The act of giving opened the heart. It softened the soul. It made space for something larger than oneself to enter and sit beside the stillness. Not all households believed the gods took the offerings literally. Some thought the offerings remained physically untouched because the gods absorbed only the essence. But others believed that in the deepest part of the night, the gods truly came, invisible and soft-footed, and dined at these sacred places, leaving behind only the echo of their presence. By morning, the offerings were removed quietly. The food might be buried near fig trees, burned with herbs, or returned to the earth, never discarded casually. What had once fed the gods could not return to ordinary status. It had passed through a mystery. It had seen something no human eye could hold. Even those who doubted still participated, not out of fear, but out of inheritance. The rituals had been passed down for too long to ignore. They were woven into the fabric of the home, like the soot on the ceiling, like the grooves in the stone. The offering was part of being Egyptian, part of breathing, living, dying, and hoping. And so, night after night, from temple cities to desert hamlets, offerings glimmered in the hush, tiny moons in the dim corridors of homes. A bowl, a fig, a flicker of flame. The gods, wherever they were, could feel it. A land speaking in gestures, a people opening their palms to the stars. Egypt, wrapped in linen and shadow, giving back what it had borrowed from heaven. When the offerings had been placed, and the shadows inside the home had grown long and full, the final rite before sleep began. The prayers of the mouth. In ancient Egypt, words held weight. They were not casual breath, they were creation itself. The act of speaking, especially by night, when the world was softer and the veil between realms thinner, was an act of weaving magic into the darkness. The Egyptians believed that what was spoken aloud, even in a whisper, echoed into the unseen. Prayers were not only heard, they were felt. The mouth was seen as a sacred gate. It was the channel through which songs passed, spells were cast, names remembered. Just as the embalmer opened the mouth of the dead so that they could eat and speak in the afterlife, so too did the living use the mouth each night to bridge the waking world and the realm of dreams. Children, the elderly, even the silent all, participated in this rite, in their own way. Sometimes it was a chant, sometimes only a breath, shaped by memory. Some prayers were ancient, repeated across hundreds of years, passed from mother to daughter, scribe to apprentice. These were structured invocations. Praise to you, Ra, as you journey through the duat, or guard my soul, O Anubis, as I sleep with my back to the sun. They were formulas, but never hollow. Each syllable was believed to be a binding thread in the tapestry of protection. Spoken with reverence, they lit invisible lamps in the corridors of the soul. Others were deeply personal. A fisherman might whisper thanks for a day without wind. A grandmother might ask that her departed husband visit her dreams. These prayers weren't written in papyrus or recited in temples. They were born from the day's breath, its joys, regrets, and small sorrows. The gods, it was said, understood all languages, but they especially listened to truth spoken at night. Some Egyptians prayed aloud, their voices low and trembling, while others prayed silently, letting words form behind the teeth and rest on the tongue. The gods did not need volume, they needed intention. Even a prayer thought but unspoken had power, if the soul behind it was awake. In this way, the home itself became a temple of whispers. Each sleeper, a priest of their own small altar. The head of the household might lead the family in a single line, something simple: "May we sleep and wake again, or keep the breath within us, O divine." After this, silence would reign. But within that silence, hearts murmured, thoughts shifted into form. The gods were not distant, they pressed, close to the breath of the faithful, listening not for words, but for sincerity. Children were taught the names of gods early. At night, they might repeat them in sequence like a lullaby. Isis, Osiris, Nephthys, Horus, each name a step in the stairway to safety. The belief was that if one died in sleep, remembering the names would guide their soul across the dangerous paths of the Doit. Forgetfulness in death was feared. Prayer kept memory warm and near. In temples, priests recited elaborate liturgies into the night, facing east, their voices measured and trained. But in homes, the prayers were tender. A woman lying beside her husband might speak to Hathor, asking that love remained between them even as they slept apart in dream. A man might ask Thoth to bless his tongue, so he may speak wisely when dawn returned. These were not grand petitions, they were small roots of faith. Many Egyptians believed that prayer shaped the nature of dreams. A good prayer could protect one from wandering demons, or lead the spirit to sacred places, temples in the stars, fields of endless barley, rivers that never ran dry. Some even claimed they had spoken with gods in sleep, that their prayers had been answered not in this world, but in the landscapes behind the eyelids. The positioning of the body mattered. Some faced the shrine as they prayed. Others sat cross-legged by the window, watching the stars emerge. A few knelt, placing their heads to the floor, the ancient posture of surrender. No one taught these postures directly, they were absorbed. From watching, from growing, from being woven into a culture where the soul was not separate from the night. Incense often burned during the prayer. The scent lifted the words, it was believed, carrying them higher. Myrrh, cinnamon, and juniper were favorites. The smoke curled round the speaker like a blessing, wrapping the prayer in fragrance, sending it beyond the ceiling, into the sky, into the attention of the eternal. For those in mourning, prayers carried the most weight. A grieving man might speak his wife's name 3 times before sleep. A mother might call out to a lost child, asking them to visit just once, to smile in the place where dreams and waking kissed. These prayers were sometimes soaked with tears, but even sorrow was sacred when shaped by intention. The gods understood loss, they too had wept. Some offered their prayers with gift-spread crumbs left beside the bed, flowers beside a statue, a clean cloth laid over a family heirloom. These small acts reinforced the prayer, made it whole. Action and word, together, created power. To pray without offering was not incomplete, but to combine the two was to touch a deeper current of blessing. The prayer might also include silence, a long pause after a whispered word, where the breath slowed and the body stilled. In that pause, the listener was believed to draw near the god, the ancestor, the soul of the self. Egypt did not believe silence was absence. Silence was the breath of the divine, and in prayer, silence was the heart's doorway left open. When the prayer ended, many placed their fingers to their lips, then to the air, sealing the words, sending them forth. This gesture, passed down through centuries, was not always explained. It simply was, as natural as the sun rising, a closing of the sacred mouth, a release of the sacred word. Some dreams began immediately after prayer. Images poured in as the final syllable passed the lips. A field, a river, a lion, a child's voice. These were not dismissed as illusion. They were seen as replies. Dreams were how the gods answered, and the prayer was the question, the key that unlocked the door between realms. Even those who had little left, no home, no shrine, no food, could still pray. The mouth required nothing but breath, and in breath the eternal lived. A wanderer could sleep beneath the sky and still speak to Amun. A prisoner could lie on cold stone and still offer praise to Ptah. No gate was closed to the mouth that prayed with honesty. Thus, night after night, Egypt whispered to itself. Through a million lips, words floated into the dark: pleas, praises, promises. Some were long, some brief, but all were sacred. In the land of temples and tombs, The most powerful altar was sometimes no more than a breath, a name, a few words carried on the hush of night. And when at last the speaker grew quiet, and the home grew still again, there remained in the air a gentle trace not of incense or perfume, but of presence. The gods had heard, the soul had spoken. The night, rich and deep, folded its arms around them all. When the final prayers had been spoken and the air was thick with stillness, there remained one last act to ensure that the world of the living did not drift too close to the dangers of the unseen. This act was quiet, often unseen by others, but believed to carry immense power. It was the drawing of symbols, sacred marks traced in the dust, scratched into clay, painted onto doorways, or even inscribed with a finger on the skin. These were not decorations. They were shields, barriers, spells cast with curves and lines. The night was vast, but symbols could make a space small and safe. Many Egyptians believed that symbols, once drawn, became more than shapes. They became guardians living, watching, responding. The simple ankh, when placed above a bed, brought vitality to the sleeper. The wedged eye, known as the Eye of Horus, protected against unseen dangers and wandering spirits. These signs weren't abstract, they were language, protection, life. In a culture where the word could create reality, the written or drawn mark was the most enduring form of magic. These symbols were often drawn near thresholds, doorways, windows, and even across the lintels of beds. The door was especially important, for it was both an entrance and a vulnerable passage. Drawing protective signs around it transformed it into a boundary between safety and chaos. To step inside a home marked by symbols was to enter a space already claimed by order, by the forces that held the world together. Children learned early how to draw these signs, not through formal lessons, but through imitation. A mother would dip her finger in water and trace a spiral onto her child's forehead. A father would drag a stick across sand, forming a looped cross or a falcon in flight. These gestures weren't explained, they were absorbed, and over time, the child would repeat them on their own marking walls, floors, even the surface of their toys, believing instinctively in the power they carried. Some symbols were more personal. A woman might draw a zigzag pattern symbolizing water on her belly before sleep, asking the Nile to bless her with fertility. A man might etch a simple star into the palm of his hand with ash, asking for clarity in dreams. These were not the public symbols carved into temple pillars. These were the intimate ones, small, spontaneous, and full of intention. In wealthier homes, these markings might be applied with pigment red ochre, black coal, or crushed malachite. Brushes made from reeds were kept near altars, ready for nightly use, but most often, symbols were made with the body itself. A fingertip dragging across dust, a nail scratched against a wall, a toe pressing into the earth before a step was taken. These gestures were silent but full of voice. Before drawing, some would whisper the name of the symbol, not loudly, just enough for the air to catch it. The name called forth the spirit of the mark. Saying Ankh gave breath to the shape. Saying Jed called stability into the room. The word and the shape, when joined together, created something living, him, invisible protector whose eyes never closed. Even tombs bore these marks, not just the grand inscriptions meant to honor the dead, but small, hidden symbols carved into the ceilings or floors. These were often drawn by the workersmen who feared that if they did not mark the space, something might follow them home. The same fear and the same hope lingered in every Egyptian home by night. Some households had a specific ritual. Before bed, the eldest member would walk the perimeter of the room, pausing at each corner to draw a symbol. It might be the knot of Isis, the open hand, or a coiled serpent. Each symbol had its purpose, one for love, one for protection, one for wisdom, one for peace. By the end of the walk, the room felt different, as though woven tight with invisible thread. Symbols weren't always physical. Some traced them in the air, just above their heads or beds. A quick motion, a circle, a cross, a spiral drawn with breath or intention. These symbols vanished instantly, yet were believed to linger in the realm beyond sight. They were sigils, made of will, not ink, and their power was no less than those chiseled into stone. Women often drew symbols onto sleeping infants. A line down the back, a loop on the soles of the feet, a dot between the eyes. These signs were quiet songs of protection, ways of wrapping the child in layers of meaning the world could not see. When the baby stirred, the mother would touch the sign again, reaffirming the boundary, as if whispering to the night, "Not this one is mine." During certain seasons, special symbols were used, ones drawn only during festivals, or eclipses or floods. The scarab, symbol of transformation; the lion's paw, sign of courage; the twisted rope, representing eternity. Each moment had its mark, and the mark carried the weight of centuries. To draw one was to stand in the stream of time, join two ancestors by gesture alone. Some men, especially those who worked with metals or stone, marked their hands before sleep. The hammer and chisel had touched powerful things during the day tools, temples, tombs. Before sleep, they traced symbols of cleansing onto their palms, ensuring that no residue of the otherworldly would follow them into dreams. For they knew that power, if not balanced, could become poison. In desert dwellings, where wind howled and stars bled silver, symbols were drawn onto tents or stone walls. These were shaped quickly, with urgency. A circle to keep sand spirits out, a falcon eye to scare off the watchers, a wave to invite dreams. The marks faded with time, but that was the nature of magic, ephemeral, yet eternal. Even in prisons or sickness, those unable to move would draw symbols with breath, a slow exhale shaped like a spiral, a hum that traced the curve of an ankh. These invisible gestures were perhaps the most powerful. Made without hand or tool, they came straight from the soul, and in doing so, they reminded the gods that the soul had not forgotten how to speak. Some symbols were kept hidden, drawn on the underside of furniture, within folds of cloth, on the back of a lover's neck. These were private charms, unseen spells. A woman might trace a tiny lotus on the inside of her thigh, asking for gentle dreams. A man might mark the sole of his foot with the eye of Horus, so his spirit would know how to return. These marks faded, but they lingered in the mind, glowing faintly in the dark. Elders told stories of signs drawn wrong, crooked ankhs, backward eyes that caused confusion in the spirit world. That's why care mattered. A rushed mark could invite mischief, but one made slowly, with full heart, even if imperfect, would be honored. The gods understood effort. They honored the honest hand. Before finally lying down, some would sit in the stillness and gaze at the marks, watching them glow faintly in the lamplight. A crescent of safety, a spiral of breath, a pair of lines joined like arms around a heart. These weren't just lines, they were companions, guardians who stood between the sleeper and the chaos that roamed beyond the curtain of sleep. And when all was done, symbols drawn, prayers said, offerings made, the family could close their eyes, not with fear, but with faith. The marks on the wall, the air, the skin they would hold. They would stand. They would watch when the eyes of the living finally fell into dreams. As the household settled into its final silence, the act of lying down for sleep was far from casual. In ancient Egypt, the repositioning of the body was a ritual in itself, deeply symbolic, shaped by generations of belief, and steeped in the language of gods, death, and rebirth. To lie in the wrong direction, to fold the limbs carelessly, or to rest without thought was to risk imbalance, to open oneself to spiritual disorder. The act of sleep mirrored the journey of the dead, and the posture one adopted echoed the sacred forms found in tombs and temple reliefs. The body was treated as a vessel for the soul, and that vessel had to be arranged with purpose. Before lying down, many would sit cross-legged upon their mats, their eyes adjusting to the dim light cast by a fading oil lamp. In this moment, breath slowed, thoughts calmed, and attention turned inward. Some whispered names of the deities they wished to accompany them through the night. Others rubbed their limbs gently with scented oil, not for vanity, but to remind the body of its divinity. The positioning always began with the head. It was often aligned to face east, the direction of the sunrise. This was not accidental. It symbolized a readiness to be reborn, just as Ra was each dawn. The east was not only a cardinal direction, it was hope, renewal, and the threshold of awakening. Even in unconsciousness, the soul was expected to recognize the pull of the light. To sleep facing the rising sun was to trust in resurrection. Preferred to sleep on their left side, a gesture of humility. The left side was associated with the feminine, with Isis, and with protection. To lie this way was to rest under the wings of the mother. Others chose the right, seeking alignment with Osiris, king of the afterlife. Either position was acceptable, so long as it was chosen with awareness. The body was not a thing to collapse into, it was a living altar. Hands were often placed, over the chest, one atop the other, mimicking the pose of Osiris in tomb iconography. This posture was seen as a protective seal over the heart, the most sacred organ, believed to house memory, morality, and the spark of divine judgment. Covering it with one's own hands formed a symbolic barrier, guarding it from intrusion, and affirming that the soul within was self-aware and sacred. The legs were sometimes gently crossed at the ankles or kept parallel and still. The crossing of limbs echoed the bound mummies of the royal dead, though here the binding was metaphorical. It was a surrender to stillness, a way of saying, "I am ready to leave my waking form behind." For just as the soul of the deceased traveled through the deep, so too would the dreamers flying into the night's invisible corridors, in homes with multiple sleepers, such as families gathered in a single room. Space was still marked by invisible lines. Each person had their own small realm, often defined by their posture and facing. Children might lie curled inward, feet tucked beneath them, while elders stretched toward the east, their limbs long and unmoving like trees, awaiting the sun. These physical positions mirrored social roles, binding the household in invisible harmony. Some wrapped themselves in linen with great care, believing that the tighter the wrap, the more protected the soul. Others preferred loose cloth, allowing their bodies to feel the cooling breath of the night air. Both forms had spiritual merit. The bound body echoed the coffin, secure, untouchable. The open wrap resembled the wind-blown sails of Ra's boat, ready for the soul's flight. Women often repositioned their hair before lying down, not simply for comfort, but to avoid knots that symbolized confusion in dreams. Combing was a nightly prayer, a way to straighten not just strands but thoughts. Some tied their hair in knots that represented the looped symbol of eternity, believing this would help their dreams loop back into wakefulness safely. Certain households practiced mirroring, where the sleeping form imitated the pose of a deity or sacred animal. A child might lie with arms at their sides like a falcon, honoring Horus. A man might curl like a scarab, seeking transformation. A woman might place one hand across her navel in the pose of Hathor, hoping to dream of beauty and renewal. These positions were quiet acts of devotion, shaping not only the night, but the dreams to come. The very act of lying down was slow. There was no sudden collapse, no careless turning. It was done with breath, with rhythm, as if one were being lowered into the sacred tomb of sleep. Some even spoke a phrase aloud, such as "I lie down as Osiris," or "I rest in the arms of Nut." These affirmations made the body more than flesh. They declared it a participant in a cosmic pattern. Those suffering illness or grief often altered their sleeping pose. They might lie curled around an amulet, or face a doorway left slightly ajar, inviting the spirit of a loved one to visit. They might draw knees to chest, imitating the fetal position, returning symbolically to the womb of the goddess. In these postures, sleep became medicine, ritual realignment, and prayer folded into muscle and joint. For travelers or the poor, sleep was taken on rooftops or in the open air. Even without mats, they repositioned their bodies with care. A sleeping pose was a shield against night's dangers. It was believed that even the gods watched over those who positioned themselves properly, regardless of status. So long as the body spoke the language of sacred rest. Sometimes, the dying would be gently repositioned by loved ones as they slipped into final sleep. Their head turned east, arms crossed, mouth closed. These were not just gestures for the dead, but a final gift from the living, away to ensure their dreams would take them beyond. These moments echoed nightly rituals in miniature, showing how close sleep and death had always been. Certain individuals practiced breath alignment while lying down, breathing deeply, slowly, in time with the imagined breath of the Nile, inhaling with the tide, exhaling with its retreat. This allowed the body to sink into the current of the divine, making it easier for the BA to rise and the body to rest without clinging. Breath was more than air, it was a vessel, a raft in the darkness. Some left one hand open while the other remained closed. This balance symbolized the tension between receptivity and holding. The open hand invited blessings, the closed one preserved the self. This duality between letting go and guarding was at the heart of Egyptian cosmology, and the body mirrored it, even in the quietest of postures. Young couples sometimes lay back to back, their spines touching. This alignment created an invisible channel of shared heat, breath, and dreaming. They believed that in such a pose, their ka, or spiritual doubles, would journey together in dreams, finding each other in the fields of the next world. To share a posture was to share a path beyond. The position of the feet was also symbolic. Feet facing west signaled trust in Ra's journey through the underworld. Feet facing north or south could indicate specific desires, north for clarity, south for passion. These directions were not just navigational, they were spiritual codes, guiding the soul like stars guided the sailors. Some left a small space beside them, even in crowded homes. This space was not wasted, it was for the unseen, for a god, an ancestor, a dream guide. To sleep with room for the divine was to declare that even in unconsciousness, one remained open to visitation. These invisible guests were not feared, they were honored, expected, longed for. Over time, each household developed its own sleep patterns. Certain families always slept in a spiral, heads pointing inward, like petals of a lotus. Others aligned, in rows, each body a mark of symmetry. These arrangements carried meaning not just in comfort, but in energy, in balance, in spiritual discipline passed down without words. Elders often repositioned several times before finding the right pose. They called this listening to the bones. The body, aged and wise, knew where it must point to find peace. Each adjustment was a prayer without sound, a silent search for alignment, both earthly and eternal. Even those who couldn't move due to age, illness, or injury were helped into the right posture by loved ones. The act of repositioning someone else became a service, a blessing. It meant that the journey would not begin in chaos, that the soul would rise from a place of care. And when at last all bodies had stilled, when breath had slowed to the rhythm of crickets and distant waters, the home glowed with invisible order. Each sleeping form was a rune, a glyph, etched in silence across the floor. The gods, watching, could read the meaning written in flesh and form. In this careful arrangement of limbs, direction, and breath, the Egyptians did not merely fall asleep. They entered the sacred cycle of death and rebirth, carried on the back of dreams, and wrapped in the order of the cosmos. Each body, no matter how humble, lay like a statue in a hidden tomb, waking for the first rays of dawn to awaken it again. As the final hush swept over the chambers and hallways, as the oil lamp's flame trembled its last, one more ancient ritual remained before surrendering to the realm of dreams. The realm of dreams, the wrapping of hair and skin. It was not simply vanity or protection. In ancient Egypt, the body was a sacred vessel, the soul's temporary dwelling, and it deserved to be treated as such. Nighttime was a vulnerable hour, when both body and spirit drifted, and to wrap the flesh was to honor it, to declare, in silence, that one's form was worthy of divine sleep. Hair, in particular, held powerful meaning. It was not merely decoration, but a vessel of memory, sensuality, and spiritual energy. Women gathered it gently before bed, smoothing it with palm or comb, whispering blessings into its length. Coils, braids, and ties were made not just to avoid tangles, but to weave intention into every strand. To sleep with hair undone was seen by some as an invitation to chaos. To wrap it was to shield the self from nocturnal winds that stirred the soul. Cloth used for wrapping the hair was often fragrance soaked in rosewater, myrrh, or crushed lotus. These scents carried more than pleasantness. They summoned memories, calmed nerves, pleased protective spirits, and sent messages to the gods. A wrap that smelled of the Nile's banks or the perfume of a sacred garden was a prayer in itself. Some kept special wraps just for sleep, softened by years, folded with care, passed down from mothers to daughters. Men, too, honored their heads in sleep. Whether bald or adorned with short curls, they rubbed their scalps with oils pressed from olives or black cumin. A father might dab his temples with cooling herbs before tying a strip of linen around his brow. This strip, simple and light, marked the closure of the day's thoughts. Just as scribes sealed scrolls with ribbon, so too did the men of Egypt seal their minds for the passage into dream. Beyond the head, the body was gently cocooned. Linen was preferred pure, clean, and soft as breath. It was believed to carry sacred memory, being the same cloth used in mummification. The act of wrapping oneself for sleep mirrored the wrapping of the dead, but not in morbidity and reverence. To lie still beneath folded linen was to acknowledge that the soul's nightly journey was akin to the soul's final one. It was preparation for return, not departure. The feet, often dusty from the day's walking, were rinsed and dried with care. Then, a strip of cloth or softened leather might be bound around the ankles, not tightly, just enough to signal containment. The feet were sacred. They carried the person from market to temple, from birth to burial. To wrap them was not to restrain them, but to thank them, and to protect them from the chill of forgotten spirits wandering low to the ground. Some wrapped their hands, especially those that had labored. The hands were dipped in oil, then enclosed in thin gloves or bound with narrow strips. Calluses softened overnight, and the fingers relaxed. It was said that a well-wrapped hand dreamed of creation, of shaping pots, of weaving, of touching loved ones no longer living. Unwrapped, it dreamed of violence, of work unfinished, of fears too loud, too quiet. Thus, the wrapping was both a bomb and a boundary. Infants were swaddled more tightly than adults, their tiny arms tucked close to their hearts. This swaddling mirrored the divine Horus himself was once bound in similar cloths, protected from Set's cruelty by layers of warmth. Mothers sang as they wrapped, not lullabies, but invocations. May your dreams be straight. May your soul not wander far. May your ancestors carry you safely. These were the songs that slipped between threads, stitched into the folds. The wrapping was not always external. Some people imagined themselves wrapped in light, a self-woven cocoon of protection. They would lie flat and picture golden threads winding up from their toes to their crown, encasing them in radiance. These mental wrappings were especially favored by priests, who understood that not all garments were of cloth. Some were of will, breath, and prayer. The soul, after all, needed dressing just as much as the skin. Those mourning a loved one sometimes wore their burial garments to sleep, not to court death, but to remember it. A widow might wear her husband's sash. A son might wrap himself in his father's cloak. This was not morbid. It was communion. The garment became a bridge, and the night became a temple, where time blurred. Dreams carried voices, gestures, scents. In wrapping, the living clung gently to the warmth of those just beyond reach. Elder women often wore veils or scarves over their faces, tied loose but deliberate. This protected not just from insects or dust, but from spiritual confusion. It was believed that the face, being the mirror of the soul, should not be left uncovered to whatever forces drifted in sleep. The veil acted as a second skin, a curtain, between this world and that one. Through it, only dreams with names could pass. Certain healers marked their linen with signs, symbols drawn in charcoal or saffron before sleep. A crescent at the chest, a loop near the wrist. These markings activated dreams of guidance, of medicinal knowledge, of spiritual diagnosis. The wrapping became not only protection but a mappage symbol, a torch to light the way through the tangled paths of unconsciousness. Children often mimicked these rituals playfully. A girl might wrap her doll in ribbon, whispering that she was sending her to meet Bastet in the dream. A boy might fold his favorite cloth like a pharaoh's robe, pretending he would dream as a king. These gestures, while innocent, mirrored deep truths. Through imitation, children rehearsed the sacred choreography of rest. It was also common to wrap or cover amulets worn against the skin. The heart scarab, the ujot eye, or the knot of Isisthenes were often tied with an extra strip of cloth. At night, this did not hide their power, but intensified it. Covered in linen, closer to flesh, the amulet's energy was sealed, focused. It pulsed beneath the fabric like a heartbeat, dreaming alongside its wearer. Some households kept special wrapping cloths that were never used during the day. These were not for sweat or labor, but for rest alone. They were folded beside sleeping. Mats, smelling of lavender or lotus, stitched with quiet symbols only the family knew. To be wrapped in such a cloth was to enter a story older than memory, one passed from generation to generation, without needing to be told. Men who had returned from war or long journeys often wrapped themselves entirely head to toe in their first night home. It was a ritual of re-entry, of shedding the danger and dust of the road. In this cocoon, they relearned their breath, re-met their wives in sleep, and offered their bodies back to the rhythms of home. Their limbs, tightly wrapped, whispered to the house, "I have returned. I remember how to rest." On festival nights, wrappings were adorned with pattern stripes, stars, lotus petals. These were not seen by anyone else, yet they mattered. They turned sleep into celebration. It was believed that such nights carried potent dreams, visions sent by Hathor, Ra, or even the silent ancestors. To wrap oneself beautifully was to prepare for a visitation, to greet the divine in one's own temple of linen and flesh. Even those who lived alone wrapped themselves with care, especially them. The act of wrapping was a reminder that the body was not abandoned, that solitude was not emptiness. The cloth became a companion, a gentle weight reminding the skin that it was still sacred. In loneliness, the ritual became a balm softening the ache, quieting the hunger for other voices. Some ended the wrapping by tying a knot, a small, humble one, over the heart or stomach. This knot, simple in form, was a sacred seal. It held the dreams in, kept the chaos out, whispered to the soul, remain near. In the morning, this knot would be the first thing to come undone, unraveling the veil between the dream world and the waking day. And when at last the cloth was settled, when every strand of hair was tucked, and every fold of skin caressed by linen, the body lay like a scroll inscribed, wrapped, sealed, and waiting to be read by the gods of dream. The night did not fear such a body, it welcomed it, for here was one who remembered that even sleep required ceremony. Long after the final words were whispered, and the bodies wrapped in linen and shadow, one light remained above them, all silent, ancient, and ever watchful. The moon, its glow, slipped through lattice windows and narrow slits, brushed over rooftops, and date palms poured like milk across stone courtyards and beaten earth. In ancient Egypt, the moon was not a passive observer, was an active presence. Its gaze was believed to pierce veils, to soften grief, to stir the soul's slow dance between this world and the next. To watch the moon before sleep was a sacred gesture of remembrance. The moon was the eye that did not blink. It was Thoth's mirror, the gentle twin of the sun, drifting across the night sky, not to banish darkness, but to shape it. Its light was cooler, more forgiving than the searing blaze of Ra, and so, under its gaze, the Egyptians found solace. Many stepped outside just before retreating to their mats, not to speak, not to gather, but to watch, in stillness, in reverence, in longing. They offered the moon no words, only their breath. Mothers held their babies beneath its soft halo, letting its beams wash over the child's closed eyelids, whispering silently for health, for quiet dreams. Elderly men leaned on canes beside doorways, staring upward as if awaiting a reply. The moon, they believed, knew their names. It had watched them grow, had seen the wrinkles form and the laughter fade. In its presence they felt remembered, even when others had forgotten. Some considered the moon a protector of secrets. Its phases mirrored life's cycles: birth, fullness, withering, and return. On nights when it was full, dreams were said to be more vivid, more prophetic. Lovers made vows beneath it, not for romance, but for permanence. Farmers offered silent thanks if their fields lay silvered by its light, for they believed such a blessing would ensure fertile soil and soft rains. Priests of Thoth, the god of writing and time, often kept moon journals, simple parchment scrolls, noting the moon's shape, color, rise, and fall. They believed that each phase aligned with certain truths, and that to record them was to better understand the will of the cosmos. But even the unlettered honored the moon. A child, resting on a mother's lap, would point upward and ask, "Is that the god's eye?" And the mother would nod, never explaining further. She didn't need to. Some drew moon shapes into the sand before sleep: a crescent, a circle, a thin silver bow. These symbols acted as invitations, signaling to the moon that its light was welcome, that its watching was desired. These shapes were erased by the morning, but it didn't matter. The moon remembered. It always remembered. For those who had lost someone recently, the moon held particular gravity. A widow might sit alone on the rooftop, wrapped in a thin shawl, tracing the outline of her husband's face onto the sky. It was believed that the dead could visit more easily on moonlit nights, that their souls rose like vapor, drawn upward, guided by the cool light, until they reached the stars. The moon served as a lantern, a guide across the river between now and forever. Musicians sometimes tuned their lyres or flutes under moonlight, not to perform, but to feel the vibration of strings beneath its gaze. They believed that certain tones could only be struck at night, that the moon altered sound, the way it bent light, making it more tender, more truthful. These tones, like lullabies to the gods, floated silently through sleeping alleys and open rooftops. Many believed the moon could read faces, that it watched the lines formed by frowns or smiles and carried these images to the gods. And so, before bed, some made sure to smile at the moon just briefly, a soft lifting of the lips, hoping it would carry their best self forward, like a message sealed in moonlight. Even grief, when offered to the moon, seemed lighter, more bearable under its slow orbit. Children often made up stories about the moon, that it was a silver cat prowling across the sky, that it was a forgotten god searching for his brother, the sun, that it was a mirror dropped from heaven, reflecting the Nile's deepest secrets. These stories were never corrected. They were sacred in their own way, teaching that the moon was not just a rock in the sky, it was a companion, a keeper, a soft eye in the night. Some homes had narrow slits built high in the walls, aligned just so, to let the moon's light fall upon small altars or water basins. The light was believed to purify, to stir the water into still prophecy. A priestess might gaze into such a basin and wait for the reflection of the moon to ripple. Then she would know if a dream was coming, or if an ancestor was near. Fishermen who could not sleep would sit on the shore and watch the moon dance on the black surface of the Nile. To them, the river and the moon shared a secret kinship, both flowing, both shifting, both full of silence. They dropped small tokens into the water beads, carved shells, dried lotus petals, offering them to the goddess of the moon, whose name was sometimes known and sometimes lost in the folds of history. Women in mourning often wore white linen under the moon, letting its light reflect off the fabric like a second skin. They believed that doing so would cleanse their sorrow, that it would dry their tears with gentleness no human hand could offer. In those quiet moments, when the night was still and the moon was full, even sorrow felt sacred, part of a larger, older song. Even slaves, exhausted and broken from labor, would lift their eyes to the moon, not to complain, not to plead, to be seen, to know that something larger, older, unchanging still watched them, even when no one else did. The moon did not discriminate. It watched pharaoh and pauper with the same light, reminding all that dignity could not be stolen when the night bore witness. Some women, before lying beside their husbands, would open a window shutter just slightly, allowing a sliver of moonlight to kiss the floor. They believed this light softened anger, eased tension, helped the house breathe. The moon was a bomb, not just to the skin, but to the spirit of the dwelling. Its light cooled the heat of the day's arguments, dulled the sharpness of words spoken too harshly. The moon was often called the listener, especially by those who slept alone. They would speak their hearts quietly beneath its gaze, not as prayer, but as release. These were not formal words. They were sighs, regrets, longings folded into sound. The moon, high and indifferent, seemed to nod. It took nothing, gave nothing, but it listened. And sometimes that was enough. Even when clouds veiled its face, the moon was acknowledged. People would glance upward and say, "It is still there." This faith was passed on not in temples, but through gesture, through silence, through stories told beside fire. The moon's presence was not dependent on visibility. Its watching was eternal, patient, faithful. And finally, as the watchers drifted back to their mats, eyes heavy, bodies wrapped, hearts slower, they knew the moon would remain. It would outlast their sleep, witness their dreams, greet the prowling cats and whispering winds. The last light they saw was not fire, but moon, cool, silver, sacred, a promise written not in stone, but in the air. Before the veil of night could truly close, there remained a final act for many within the walls of ancient Egypt, an act both sacred and intimate, carried out beneath flickering lamplight or pale moonbeam. It was the reading of amulets, not merely wearing them, but studying them, touching them, whispering to them. These tiny objects, cradled in the palm, hung upon the chest, or tied gently at the wrist, were more than charms. They were fragments of the divine, shaped in copper, gold, faience, and stone, each one a prayer made solid. To read an amulet was to remember what it protected and who had passed it on. A father's scarab given to his daughter before she bore her first child. A mother's knot of Isis wrapped around her son's arm before battle. These objects were heavy with memory, with breath. They did not simply sit upon the body they watched. They listened, they pulsed faintly with purpose. Each one bore its own message, and each message was read before sleep to guard the soul's long descent. Some held their amulets close to the lips and whispered their true names, not the names given in markets or temples, but secret ones learned. Over years, it was believed that every amulet had a name known only to its wearer, a word that stirred its power. These names were never spoken aloud to others. They were folded deep into the linen of the night, released only when the stars had taken their place and silence pressed against the walls. The eye of Horus, a common companion, was more than a symbol of protection. It was a guardian of perception, of dreams unmarred by illusion. Those who wore it often gazed into its curved lines before sleep, tracing the spiral with a fingertip, calling on clarity to visit them in dreams. It was said that the eye did not merely see outward, but inward, reflecting the truth of the wearer's own soul. The ankh symbol of life was read like a promise. Its loop whispered continuity, its crossbeam stability. Those who feared illness or death held it close at night, reminding themselves that life did not end with breath. Its form was eternal, as was the soul. To touch an ankh before sleep was to remind the self, I am not only body, I am cycle, I am return, I am Ra rising once more. Many favored the Jed pillar, spine of Osiris, a symbol of stability and endurance. Its ridged form, cool in the fingers, brought grounding to those whose minds raced or whose hearts trembled. Farmers clutched it after long days of toil, whispering to their backs, to their knees, to the earth, hold fast, hold true. To fall asleep, holding a Jed was to descend into dreams rooted in strength. The Tayat knot, or girdle of Isis, was often worn by women, especially those in childbearing years. Before sleep, they rubbed it gently, praying for fertility, for safety, for the protection of their womb and the souls within. The knot was not just symbolic, it was a tether, binding the woman to her goddess, weaving her body into divine cloth. Some tied it into their hair as well, believing it would protect their thoughts as much as their flesh. Children often slept with simple amulets, carved lions for bravery, small frogs for growth, scarabs for transformation. Before sleep, a parent would sit beside them, take the charm in hand, and speak softly. This protects you from harm. This guides you in the night. This watches while you sleep. These nightly readings were lullabies wrapped in meaning, words that anchored the child in safety. Some households kept bowls of shared amulets, passed from member to member as needed. A man might borrow a sister's feather of mat before a difficult trial. A grandmother might give her serpent amulet to a restless boy. These amulets were not static. They traveled, adapted, formed bonds with each bearer. Before bed, they were studied carefully, their surfaces worn smooth by years of fingers, their stories known and retold. Certain priests and scribes possessed elaborate amulets carved with textile spells, prayers, or declarations etched into lapis or ivory. These were not worn so much as read nightly. By reciting the inscribed lines aloud, the wearer reawakened the power within. These readings were not rushed. They were done slowly, deliberately, as if uncoiling a scroll inside the heart. The words were not decoration, they were doors. Amulets of animals were especially potent. The jackal for Anubis, to guide the soul through shadow. The crocodile for Sobek, to guard against unseen teeth. The cat for Bastet, to watch over the home's thresholds. Each animal had its hour, and the reader had to know when to call upon which form. To read the wrong amulet on the wrong night was not dangerous, but fruitless, like knocking on a door no one was behind. Some wore amulets, strung with multiple charms, each one representing a part of the body, a corner of the soul, a hope for tomorrow. These necklaces or girdles were read link by link before sleep. A woman might murmur, for my eyes, the Utjat, for my breath, the lotus, for my heart, the ankh, for my womb, the Tayat, for my feet, the Jed. This was not was language, one more intimate than speech. In certain houses, one member served as the night reader, often the elder. They would walk from bed to bed, gently lifting each person's amulet, whispering its truth over their sleeping form. It was said that the gods heard these readings, and that the amulets glowed slightly in return. The reader did not disturb the sleepers. Their voice was like water moving through reeds, soft, constant, holy. Sometimes amulets broke or cracked with age. These were not discarded. They were wrapped in cloth and placed on altars or buried beneath trees. But first, they were read one final time, thanked for their service, praised for their silence, mourned for their departure. Some believed that these amulets returned to the gods, carrying with them the scent and story of the one they'd guarded. Not all amulets were shaped. Some were simple stones, marked only by the memory of a prayer. A father might press a river pebble into his daughter's palm, saying, "This is from the water that watched you be born." That alone made it sacred. Each night she read it by remembering the words he spoke. These unmarked charms carried the deepest roots, woven not by craftsmen but by love. The reading of amulets was not always solemn. Sometimes it was just a quiet celebration of having made it through the day. A man might grin as he kissed his scarab, saying, "Still here, old friend." A child might giggle as she held her cat charm up to the moon, pretending it could purr. These moments, simple and full of breath, were offerings in their own right. Amulets were also passed between lovers before sleep. A woman might unfold her knot of Isis and press it into her partner's hand. "Tonight, you wear my strength." A man might remove his falcon charm and tie it into his lover's braid. "Fly with me in your dreams." These exchanges were not acts of possession, but of trust. The amulet carried not only its own magic, but the heart of the giver. Those suffering nightmares sometimes placed multiple amulets in a circle around their bed. This was called the net of night, a boundary drawn in bronze and stone. Before lying down, the sleeper would read each amulet aloud, creating a chain of guardianship. If a dream turned dark, it was believed that one of the amulets would absorb the fear, break in its place, and spare the soul. Travelers always carried a pouch of amulets, reading them anew in unfamiliar lands. For the foreign winds, the lotus; for unknown waters, the crocodile; for sleep in strange places, the jackal. These recitations were done with bowed head and open heart, turning the unfamiliar into sacred ground, anchoring the self in meaning, even when far from home. On nights of illness, amulets were read more urgently, their names called out in voices just above a whisper. Ankh, give breath; Jed, give strength; Udijat, see what I cannot. Some families chanted together, creating a gentle rhythm in the dark. These were not spells cast in panic, they were lullabies of resilience. Lullabies woven through stone and spirit, and when at last the amulet was returned to the neck or wrist, and the body reclined in its linen nest, the soul felt cradled not only by cloth and posture, but by memory and intention. The amulet did not sleep, it stood sentinel. It listened to the dreams it had helped shape, ready to stir should danger draw near. The final act was always silence. The wearer would breathe in, touch the charm once more, and then let the night take them. No more words were needed. The amulet had been read, the bond reaffirmed, the night understood, and beneath that silence, thousands of amulets across the land pulsed like distant stars, each one glowing faintly in the dark. In the deepening hush of the house, when the last coals dimmed in the hearth, and the scent of perfumed linen lingered like a fading hymn, the final transition awaited. The bed no mere slab of wood and rope transformed into a vessel of passage. In the minds of the ancient Egyptians, lying down upon it was not merely a retreat into sleep, but the bed became a sacred boat, modeled in miniature upon the grand solar bark of Ra, prepared to carry its passenger through the underworld of dreams and into the dawn of rebirth. Each household, rich or poor, approached the bed with an understanding of this symbolism. Some beds were carved with legs shaped like lion's paws or bull's hooves, giving the illusion that the sleeper rested atop a living beast, one that would stride silently through darkness. Others were humble mats rolled onto packed earth, but even those were treated with reverence. Their arrangement still echoed the great myths: a sleeper's head pointing east, their feet toward the hidden west, mirroring the eternal journey of the sun. Before lying down, many would run their fingers along the frame of their bed, tracing the worn wood or smoothed rope lattice. These touches were not idle, they were quiet acknowledgments. Just as a sailor checks the hull before launch, the Egyptian checked their vessel, ensuring its readiness for the nightly voyage. Cracks in the frame were patched not only for comfort, but to maintain the bed's spiritual integrity. A flawed vessel could invite troubled dreams, or worse, block the return path to waking life. Some placed symbols at the foot of their beds, teeny carvings of fish, papyrus boats, or celestial stars. These were not decorations, but guides. In sleep, when the body's senses dulled and the soul drifted free, it was believed such tokens acted like celestial compasses. Their presence helped the dreamer navigate the shadowed rivers of night, reminding the soul of home, of intention, of its identity. Children were often told tales before bed, not just for entertainment, but to prepare them for the dream journey. Stories of Ra's nightly battle with Apep, the serpent of chaos, served not only to thrill, but to warn. Darkness was not empty. It was full of movement, of testing. But with a strong vessel, a pure heart, a clean bed, a guided soul, one could pass through unscathed. Just as Ra rose each morning, the bed was the child's bark, and dreams were their stars to follow. Lovers treated their shared bed as a temple ship. Before sleep, they lay facing each other, breathing in rhythm, hands brushing, hearts slowly sinking. Their union upon the bed mirrored the sacred joining of deities Isis and Osiris, Nut and Geb. In their silent warmth, they believed the bark became stronger, more luminous. Their souls could sail in tandem, wrapped in each other's scent and skin, seeking the same islands of peace in the archipelago of sleep. Elders, nearing death, often lay in their beds, as though preparing for the ultimate voyage. Their body grew still, movements ritualistic. They whispered to the ceiling, to the stars beyond it, to loved ones already gone. Their bed became a prototype for the sarcophagus, and their breath grew tidal, rising and falling like oars in deep water. In their final nights, it was said that the bark no longer traveled only through dreams, but through memory itself, sailing backward through their life. Some families painted or carved sacred symbols into the bedframe: lotuses for rebirth, ankhs for life, stars for celestial guidance. These additions were not for display. At night, the sleeper's fingers would find them in the dark, reminding the soul what it carried and what awaited. These tactile blessings served as anchors to truth when dreams became tangled or terrifying. A hand upon a carved star was a hand upon order. Against chaos, priests and priestesses slept in beds positioned in alignment with sacred geometry. These beds were not merely aligned with the stars, they were gateways. Ritual sleepers in temples were said to receive visions, messages, or healing while lying in carefully arranged stone chambers. Their beds floated not on water but on prayer, and when they woke, the messages of the gods lingered like mist in the mind's corners. Sailors, even when on land, sometimes slept in hammocks or netted mats, mimicking the sway of boats. This was less out of habit and more out of belief. To them, the rocking motion recalled the cosmic balance that floated all existence. If the bed was a bark, then movement was its breath. Even when still, they imagined drifting, rocked gently by the hand of the goddess who balanced the world upon her feather. The wealthiest families sometimes commissioned bed frames in the shape of actual boats. The headboard curved like a prow, the footboard like a stern. Painted waves ran along the sides, and the legs stood in shapes like papyrus stalks, suggesting movement over water. To sleep in such a bed was to declare oneself already on the journey, halfway to becoming a divine soul. But even among the humble, the belief held. A straw mat could float just as surely as gilded wood. Mourning families kept the deceased's bed undisturbed for several days. It was believed the soul returned briefly, to touch it, to relive the last departure. Candles were lit beside it, flowers placed upon the linen. In those moments, the bed became an echo of the sarcophagus, the place where journeys began and ended. The silence that clung to such beds was deep, mournful, and holy. Some painted their dreams onto the wood of their beds, small glyphs scratched with bone or stylus beneath the mattress where only they could see. A bird with human hands, a river that flowed upward, a staircase made of stars. These were not works of art, but navigational record stream maps kept by the soul's sailor, so they would not forget where they had once gone. Wives sometimes lay alone on one side of the bed. When their husbands traveled far, they did not sleep. In the center, that space remained sacred, empty, a river awaiting its missing vessel. They whispered into the absence, sent their dreams like folded boats across the silence. If the bed was the bark, then love was its anchor. It held firm across weeks, months, even years. Frightened children sometimes placed their feet at the headboard, reversing the sleeping position. This was a form of protest, of spiritual rebellion against nightmares or perceived omens. It was not punished. Parents understood. Sometimes a sailor must turn the vessel around to escape a storm. These small rebellions were honored, and eventually, the bed would be turned right again, always with ceremony. Some slept with oars. Beneath their beds, thin sticks carved from driftwood or river reeds. These oars were talismans, never touched. While waking, they were for the soul to use, should the night grow dark. In this belief, the dreamer was not merely a passenger, but a rower, an active participant in their own nocturnal destiny. If a dream became a storm, they rode through it. In temples, sacred beds were left for gods alone. No one lay upon them. They remained untouched, draped in the finest cloths, waiting eternally. These were not furniture, but shrines. Offerings were placed upon them: incense, bread, flowers, as if the god had only just risen or was about to return. They served as reminders to all. The journey of sleep was a mirror of the journey of gods. In many homes, the bed was passed down through generations. Scratches from a grandmother's rings, ink stains from a father's writing. Each mark told a story. Children knew them by touch, even in the dark. The bed, then, became not only a bark, but a library, a repository of to sleep upon it was to sail through family history, drifting on inherited breath and dream. Some placed small pots of water beneath their beds, believing that water drew away bad dreams or cooled the passage of the soul. The water, untouched, was emptied at dawn. Its surface, if undisturbed, was said to indicate peaceful sleep. If rippled, perhaps the soul had stirred too restlessly. The bed, even in stillness, marked the shape of that invisible journey. Lamps were sometimes shaped like boats, set beside the bed with the flame positioned like a guiding star. As the oil burned low, the flame flickered, mimicking the movement of a vessel on water. The sleeper, watching it dim, felt the illusion complete. The lamp became the beacon, and the sleeper, the voyager slipping away. And when finally the sleeper surrendered to rest, limbs heavy, breaths softened, dreams stirring like wind on water, the bed bore them away. No paddles, no sails, just silence, and the scent of oiled wood. It drifted, carrying hopes, regrets, longings, into the darkness. The bark knew the way. It had sailed that river countless times, each voyage a thread woven into eternity. When the wind outside quieted and the crackle of the last torch gave in to darkness, another practice began, quieter than prayers, gentler than dreams. It was the ritual of listening. For the ancient Egyptians, sleep was not only a time to speak to the divine, but also a time to hear. The walls of night held voices, not always loud, not always kind, but ever present. Listening was not done with open ears alone. It required stillness, surrender, and reverence. To listen was to open one's soul to the hush between the heartbeats of the world, and in those sacred hours, people lay still, not merely from exhaustion, but from expectation. They believed that the gods, the spirits of ancestors, and the guardians of unseen realms moved through their homes, not in grand ways but in soft creaks, in the rustle of papyrus, in the shifting of shadows. A whisper behind the wall was not ignored, it was noticed, held in thought, and sometimes greeted with a whisper in return. This was no fear, this was attention, the holy readiness to be addressed. Even the very breath of the house had its voice. The settling of beams, the faint hiss of wind through palm branches, the clink of pottery as it cooled, these were not mundane sounds. They were signs of presence, reminders that everything had a spirit, even objects. A basket did not simply rest, it exhaled its story. A sleeping cat, curled near the doorway, might twitch its ear toward a sound none could name. The wise watched it closely. Animals often heard what humans did not yet deserve to hear. Children were taught from a young age to listen with respect. A mother might hush a child, not because of noise, but to honor the silence. "Do you hear that?" she'd ask. The child, blinking, might hear only wind, but the lesson was not to catch every sound. It was to expect that there was more than sound to hear. The gods did not speak in words alone. Sometimes they murmured in the spaces between things, and the child would learn silence was not absence, it was invitation. Before sleep, some elders would lie with their heads turned toward open doors or windows. They did not seek cool air, they sought sound. A distant drumbeat, a cartwheel on gravel, a priest's chant carried by the breeze. These were clues, fragments of the world's great unfolding. The sleeper, even in age, wanted to remain part of that unfolding, to know they still had ears for the world's mysteries, even as their bodies grew weary. Priests believed that dreams were shaped by what was heard in the moments just before sleep. Therefore, they often sat upright, listening to the temple wind, the hum of insects, the shifting of robes. Some said Thoth himself sent his scribes whispers in these hours, secrets, too fragile for daylight. The priest would lie down only when the message had passed, never before. Listening, to them, was an act of priesthood as sacred as chanting or scribing. Sometimes the house itself offered stories. The tapping of a wall was not always wood contracting, it could be a memory rising. A faint melody humming through the air might be a long-lost ancestor greeting a descendant through the veil. Those who listened, not with their ears but with their spirits, could tell the difference. They would lie still and smile, nodding softly in the dark. "I hear you," they'd think. "Go on." Among the poorer families who could not afford statues or amulets, listening was their altar. A woman without gold or oil would simply close her eyes, slow her breathing, and hear the night as it moved around her. The creak of a bed frame, the scrape of a rat in the wall, the flutter of palm leaves against a roof, these were her prayers returned to her. They were proof that she was not alone, that her breath joined the music of the earth. Scribes, sometimes, recorded what they heard during these hours, not only in dreams but in waking half-sleep. A crow passed, one might write. Its wings sounded like leather drums. Or, a voice said my name. It was not my mother. It was not a stranger. These records were not edited or polished. They were kept in small scrolls, tucked beneath pillows or inside reeds. These were sound scrolls, whispers made immortal. Lovers, lying beside each other, often held their breath just to better hear the others. The rise and fall, the shift of ribs, the throat's quiet rhythm. Listening to a loved one breathe was more than tenderness. It was witnessing life continue in darkness. It was the body's song, unscripted and true. Some believed that by listening deeply enough, one could dream not alone, but together, riding the same wind through the night. The ritual of listening was also a kind of healing. Those in grief did not always pray aloud. They lay in silence, ears reaching for the one who is gone. A name might echo in a dream, or a footstep that never came. The grieving listened not for answers, but for nearness. And sometimes the rustle of a curtain, the shift of air, was enough. Enough to believe. The soul they missed had come close, had sat beside them, unseen. Storytellers claimed they didn't invent tales, they overheard them. At night, lying in the dark, they listened for ancient voices. If a tale was meant to be told, it would arrive as a rhythm, a phrase, a sudden image sparked by the sound of dripping water or the rustle of wind. These tellings were considered gifts, not creations. The ears were nets. The story passed through. In the morning, it would be spoken. Certain dreamers believed that the gods sent tests in the form of sound. A knock at the wrong hour, a song with no singer, a laugh in the courtyard when no one stood there. If the listener reacted with fear, the gods turned away. If they stayed calm, if they acknowledged the sound with respect, the gods would continue their communion. Listening was therefore a kind of gatekeeping, a way to prove one's readiness to receive. At the edge of cities, in farms where no sound but the wind lived, the ritual of listening was even deeper. There, the silence was vast, and within it moved stories older than temples. A farmer lying in his cot might hear nothing but the cry of a lone jackal, yet that cry, in his bones, was more profound than 1,000 sermons. The earth itself spoke in those places, and he, wrapped in straw and cloth, heard it all. Some claimed that even the stars made noise, not a ringing, not a chime, but a presence, a weight in the air, a thickening of time. Stargazers lay on rooftops with eyes closed, letting their ears adjust to that subtle density. The stars are speaking, they'd whisper, not in language, in gravity, in pause. These were not poets. These were farmers, bakers, weavers. Their ears were sharp, not from study, but from humility. Listening, for the dying, was often their last act. Long after their voices failed, after food or water had no use, they listened to the weeping of those around them, to the shuffle of sand outside, to the distant call of a market bell. Their eyes might not open, but their ears remained open until the very last. It was believed that when death arrived, it came not as a sight but a sound, a hush, a shift, a silence deeper than silence. Healers knew how to listen, not just with ears but with touch. They'd place a palm upon the chest or brow and wait not for a heartbeat, but for something subtler, a resistance, a flow, an echo. In the dark, they sat beside the sick, listening for the sound of illness leaving, of strength returning. They said nothing. They only waited for the body to whisper what it needed. And when the night was at its deepest, when even the cats had curled into stillness, and the winds had dropped, those who listened best heard the truest things. A memory surfacing like a bird from water, a realization unfurling gently in the spine, a wordless forgiveness, finally given. These moments could not be forced. They arrived only for those willing to receive, not with demands, but with presence. Then, as the first shades of dawn softened the sky, the ritual of listening concluded. Not abruptly, but gently, like a harp's last note. The world stirred again. Voices rose, doors opened, but the listener carried the night's messages within, folded like petals against the ribs. They did not always understand them, but they honored them, for what had been heard in darkness was holy. In the solemn depths of the night, once the household had surrendered to stillness, and even the lamps had exhaled their final flickers, there came a moment when everything stilled utterly, and in that breathless hush, the most sacred presence of all was invited in. It was not a deity carved in gold, nor a spirit that howled through acacia groves. It was the quiet, unseen breath of Matha, goddess of order, balance, and truth. She did not arrive with fanfare. She was not called by name. She simply arrived, like balance always does. When everything else had fallen silent, Mat was not worshipped with incense or drums. She was honored with alignment. The body aligned to the earth, the breath aligned to the stars, the soul aligned to its purpose. Before sleep fully took hold, those who understood the weight of her presence would lie upon their backs and open their chests to the sky. They would release the chaos of the Datha, shouted words, the sharp regrets, the envy that festered behind smiles. These were unworthy passengers for the journey into the night. To breathe in Mat was not a physical act alone. It was a spiritual surrender. It was the offering of one's soul into the balance of the universe. Some whispered apologies into the dark, not for forgiveness, but for recalibration. I was not fair. I held too tightly. I did not listen. These confessions were not dramatic. They were gentle, honest, and small. And through them, the balance was restored, even if only slightly. It was believed that Mat walked invisibly through sleeping households, weighing the air itself. Her featherlight as the hush before a dream hovered above the chests of those who breathed unevenly. Not to judge, but to remind. In temples, her feather was a glyph carved into walls and painted onto sarcophagi. But in the silence of the home, it was the echo of breath that marked her judgment. Some families placed a feather beneath their pillows, not from an ibis or falcon, but any bird that had soared. This feather was not meant to impress the gods, but to remind the sleeper, breathe gently, live gently, sleep clean. If the feather was found twisted or tossed by morning, it was said the sleeper had struggled against Mat in the night. But if it lay still, the soul had moved in balance. Children were taught to breathe slowly as they slept, not to rush into dreams, but to let their soul be carried gently, like a leaf on the Nile. Mothers would sit beside them, whispering a simple chant, inhale the stars, exhale the dust. These words were less about air than about equilibrium. The breath, to the Egyptians, was not just life, it was truth made visible. The wealthy often commissioned papyrus scrolls, painted with Mat's image wings, outstretched feather upon her head. These scrolls were not displayed in public chambers, but placed in bedrooms, above sleeping spaces. In the quiet hours, the sleeper would look once before turning inward, allowing her image to settle into their subconscious, like a compass facing a star. They did not pray to her, they aligned with her. Even the way the room was kept reflected Mat's presence. A cluttered bedchamber, filled with disorder or unspoken tension, was believed to distort the breath of the soul. Before night fell, families tidied, not out of habit, but out of reverence. Order in the room meant order in the mind. A swept floor, a folded linen, a washed bowl. These were silent hymns to the goddess of balance. Those who had quarreled during the day would often exchange a single breath before sleep, standing face to face, inhaling together once, then retreating to separate sides. It was not a full reconciliation, but an acknowledgement of shared breath, of shared humanity. Mat smiled upon those who remembered balance even in anger. She did not demand perfection, only effort. The breath of Mat was also present in dreams. A dream that unraveled wildly, without shape or meaning, was said to be a soul drifting without her guidance. But a dream that moved gently, revealing symbols, faces, or answers, was her way of speaking. Not loudly, but with softness, a voice like cool wind through reeds. The dreamer awoke, not confused, but certain that they had been shown something they already knew. Some claimed that in rare moments, when Mat's presence was especially strong, their breath and the earth's breath became one. They felt the pulse of balance in their veins, as though floating, not flying, but suspended perfectly between what was above and what was below. These moments were brief, often forgotten upon waking, but they left an imprint, a sensation of having been momentarily whole. The sick were often surrounded by silence at night, not merely to allow rest, but to invite Mat closer. Too much noise, even from grief, could scatter the soul's breath. Loved ones would sit nearby, not speaking, not praying aloud. Their presence was the ritual. Their breathing, slow and steady, formed a circle of alignment around the sick one. Even if death came, it came through balance, not chaos. When someone passed during the night, it was said Mat herself placed the final breath in their lungs, guiding it upward like smoke from incense. That last breath was not feared, it was seen as the feather lifting free, a sign that the soul had reached equilibrium and was ready to be weighed, not in punishment, but in peace. The stillness of the room was her blessing, the silence her farewell. Artisans sometimes carved Mat's symbol into the posts of a bed, not for decoration, but for symmetry. The left and right posts, the head and foot, each mirrored the structure of the world. When the sleeper lay between them, they entered the temple of balance. Their dreams unfolded not in chaos but in design, like constellations spun into cloth. Even cats, sacred and strange, were said to breathe Mat. Their stillness, their perfect landings, their watchful eyes in the dark hall echoed her nature. A cat resting beside a sleeper brought with it not only warmth, but a living example of poised equilibrium. To listen to its purring was to hear the rhythm of the goddess in miniature. In moments of despair, some whispered Mat's name, not as plea, but as a reminder. Mat, they'd exhale, bring my soul to stillness. It was not a chant, not a spell, just a release. The breath carrying the worry upward, letting the body fall back into place. These acts were unseen, unnoticed by others, but they were heard. Balance always hears. The breath of Mat was never dramatic. It did not change lives in a flash or heal wounds overnight. It worked like water smoothing stone. Night after night, breath after breath, it guided the soul back into its intended shape. Those who welcomed her did not awaken with miracles, but with quiet understanding, a small clarity, a decision made easier, a grief slightly softened before the rise of the sun. When the horizon began to blush and the birds first murmured in the trees, the breath of Mat withdrew. Not entirely, but enough to let the day begin. She left behind no trace, no scent, no sound, only a body lying peacefully, a mind still half in dream, and a soul that felt ever so slightly more centered. The night deepens to a point where even silence thickens, and the edges of the world begin to loosen. In this sacred hour, when breath is slow and the body still there, begins a quiet, imperceptible unraveling. It is not a rupture, not an escape, but a gentle parting. The soul, so long cradled within the boundaries of skin and bone, begins to drift. The Egyptians did not fear this departure, they prepared for it. The soul's separation was not death, it was night's deepest invitation, a ceremony the body could not witness, but the spirit knew by heart. This moment was never marked by bells or visions. There was no shiver, no flash of light, just a shift like a cloth being drawn slowly from a table. The ka, the double of the self, stirred first, rising faintly above the sleeping chest. It looked back once, always once, to be sure the body still breathed. It was not abandoning it. It was simply taking its leave for a while, as one slips out of a room to find air. The Baa, the soul's bird, followed more slowly, its wings quiet as regret. They drifted together, Ba and Kanot, in panic, but in rhythm. The separation was part of the soul's maintenance, a rebalancing. During the day, the world clings to the self, names, thoughts, wounds, all form knots within. At night, those knots must be undone. The soul leaves not to forget, but to remember who it was before the weight of the waking world. It was in this floating, this brief that the soul renewed its truth. For those sensitive to it, this moment could be felt like the shifting of tides beneath skin. The sleeper might sigh or shift without waking, as though some part of them remembered being whole. For the soul does not entirely sever its ties. A thin thread, finer than breath, still tethers it to the chest, to the rise and fall of lungs, to the heartbeat's quiet hammer. Should danger come, smoke sound, sickness, that thread would pull taut, yanking the soul back home. But if the night remained calm, the soul would journey on, through walls that no longer mattered, across rooftops cool with dew, past cats sleeping with one eye open. It saw the world differently from up there, not in shapes and shadows, but in meanings. A cracked pot glowed with the echo of 1,000 meals, a child's shoe hummed with laughter, even silence spoke in color. The soul, unburdened by flesh, could finally listen to what the world whispered during the day, but could not say aloud. Ancient Egyptians believed these nightly journeys were not chaotic. The soul had destinations. Sometimes it returned to places of memory, a field once walked as a child, the lap of a mother long gone, a market corner where love had first stirred. Other times, it sought answers in the future, visiting unborn decisions, choices waiting to be made. The soul, unhindered by time, traveled across it as easily as sand blown by wind. The journey was also a communion. Along the way, the soul passed others. Not all were familiar. Some were the dead, lingering near the living out of love or unfinished songs. Some were gods, or fragments of gods, appearing not as figures but as present densities in the air, warmth in impossible places, voices that arrived without sound. These encounters were never loud. They were subtle. One never remembered them clearly, but woke changed. Sometimes the soul returned with messages, not written, not spoken, but felt. A sense of peace where grief had lived. A sudden understanding of why someone left. These were not coincidences, they were souvenirs from the journey, gifts from the spirit to the waking mind. The Egyptians called this soul memory, a form of knowing deeper than thought, carried not in words but in the way one touched a doorknob or paused in the sunlight. On rare nights, the soul did not journey far. Instead, it hovered near its own sleeping form, studying the body with love and sorrow. For though the body was strong and sacred, it was also finite. The soul, eternal, knew this. Sometimes it whispered thanks into the ribs, into the jawline, into the knees that bent without complaint. Other times it wept, silently, for what the body had suffered. This was a kind of healing that no doctor could see. Priests believed that those who lived with truth made easier journeys. Their souls rose cleanly, quickly, like birds released from cages. But those who carried guilt or fear rose heavily, slowly. Some souls clung to their bodies, uncertain. They did not trust the dark. For them, the journey was shorter, and they woke more tired. This was not punishment, it was simply the weight of imbalance. Certain rituals helped ease the separation. Sacred oils rubbed on the forehead, a prayer to Mat, a small amulet of a bird or feather beside the bed. These were not superstition. They were signposts, symbols that told the soul, the way is safe, the road is open, you are expected. And when the soul saw these signs, it floated forward with greater confidence, like a child seeing a lamp in a window. Not all dreams were dreams. Some were soul echoes of the journey, blurred by the mind's struggle to translate spirit into story. A desert filled with stairs, a river running backward, a door that opens into laughter. These were not random images. They were messages, symbols glimpsed during the soul's flight. The wise did not analyze such dreams. They sat with them, waited for their meanings to unfold like lotus flowers. Healers sometimes guided souls mid-flight, not by touching the body, but by whispering to it in the dark. Go forward, let go, find the shape of your healing. These words, soft as silk, were caught by the drifting soul, absorbed not by ears, but by essence. And when the soul returned, it brought those words with it, stitched invisibly into the lining of the heart. Even in illness, the soul tried to journey, but sometimes it struggled. The body, inflamed or weakened, clutched too tightly. In these moments, the soul hovered restlessly, half separated, like a bird flapping against closed shutters. The sleeper tossed, murmured, groaned. It was the soul knocking, pleading for release. The ancient Egyptians knew this, and prayed softly beside the sick, not to cure the body, but to ease the soul's path. When a soul encountered another soul, mid-journey, be it a loved one, lost, or a stranger, it did not speak in words. It shared essence. Two souls brushing against one another left fingerprints on each other's eternity. In the waking world, this might manifest as déjà vu, as an inexplicable recognition in a stranger's eyes. I've known you, the soul whispers. Though the tongue cannot follow. Some claim that on certain nights, especially during sacred festivals, the boundary between body and soul thinned even more. On these nights, even the waking felt the pull. They stood in their doorways longer, gazed at stars with heavier hearts, heard names whispered in wind. These were not ghosts. These were their own souls, restless, eager to journey even before sleep. Children's souls traveled too, often guided by unseen hands, ancestral spirits, divine protectors. Their dreams were more vivid, their nights more filled with animals, light, and impossible shapes. This was not imagination, it was memory in reverse. the soul remembering what it knew before entering the body, and longing, briefly, to touch that knowledge again. The soul always returned. This was the law of Mat. Unless death had come, and even then, the return was only of a different kind. The soul slipped back into the body as silently as it had left. It tucked itself into lungs and limbs, finding again the rhythm of breath and heart. There was no jolt, no gasp, only a shift, like the tide changing beneath moonlight. Most never noticed, but some woke with tears, not from sorrow, but from the memory of freedom. And so the night passed. The soul, having flown, having touched truth and shadow, settled once more into its vessel of bone. The eyes fluttered, the body stirred, the mind slowly clothed itself in thought. But somewhere deep within, the soul still glowed, carrying the hush of stars, the echo of wings, the faint warmth of having left and returned. When the soul returned from its silent voyage and nestled once more within the hushed chamber of the body, the night did not immediately release its hold. Instead, it offered one final gift, a dream. But in the world of ancient Egypt, a dream was not a flickering shadow, nor a leftover of the day. It was an oracle. A dream was the final language of night, the voice of gods made soft enough for mortals to carry. It arrived when the mind was quiet, the soul newly anchored, and the body stilled in perfect balance. Dreams were treated with even the poorest farmer, sleeping on a woven mat in a mud-brick hut, would awaken and speak of his dreams as if recounting sacred prophecy. For it was believed that in those hours before dawn, the gods walked nearer to men, speaking in riddles, symbols, and silent fire. And though these messages were veiled in metaphor, they were truths offered in a language too ancient for waking words. A lion walking backward through a field of reeds, a child with wings who sang in fire, a staircase that led nowhere but never ended. These were not strange fictions, they were revelations shaped in divine logic. Dreams spoke in symbols because they did not aim at the surface. They sank into the bones, blooming days or even years later. The wise did not rush to decipher them. They listened, waited, and watched. In temple schools, there were priests whose sole duty was to interpret dreams. These men slept beneath specific stars, fasted before bed, and kept scrolls of glyphs tied to visions. But even they knew they were only guides. The truest interpreter of a dream was the dreamer's own soul, the one who had journeyed, the one who had heard. The priest's job was not to command the meaning, but to help the sleeper remember how to listen. Many homes kept a small reed scroll or clay tablet beside the bed, etched, not with spells, but with dreams. Each morning, the dreamer wrote or scratched what they could recall: an eye floating above water, the taste of laughter, the feeling of weightless fear. These fragments were not dismissed. They were studied as one might study omens in the stars or cracks in a bone. A year's worth of dreams could chart the course of a soul's life more truthfully than any spoken word. There were dreams believed to be sent by specific gods. A dream of flight was often from Horus, the falcon lord. A dream of deep stillness or endless chambers came from Osiris, ruler of the dead. If one dreamed of sudden light breaking darkness, it was Ra. And if one dreamed of questions whispered from behind curtains, it was Thoth, god of wisdom. The gods did not always announce themselves, but their presence could be felt in the structure of the vision. Some dreams were terrifying chasms opening in the earth, teeth falling like pebbles, floods that whispered your name. These were not curses, they were warnings or purifications. Just as the Nile flooded to cleanse and renew, the dream sometimes drowned the dreamer to strip away falseness. Nightmares, to the Egyptians, were not punishments, but alarms, divine bells meant to awaken a sleeping truth. Lovers sometimes shared dreams, waking at the same moment, speaking the same image, gasping the same name. This was called twinning, a sign that their souls had traveled close during the night. In these moments, no explanation was needed. They looked at one another and knew. Words could not carry the bond. The dream had already spoken what no conversation could. Children's dreams were cherished. Their words, often wild and strange, were gathered like seeds. I saw a crocodile that cried stars. I danced with a woman who had a mountain for a face. These images were recorded, repeated, and retold. They were not dismissed as nonsense, for the young were believed to be closer to the veil still. Fresh from the world beyond, their dreams were untouched, unguarded truths. The pharaoh's dreams were sacred above all. His visions were read by councils, interpreted with care, and sometimes hidden if their message was too dangerous. A dream of his own death, of rebellion, or of the gods turning away, these could shake kingdoms. Some pharaohs built temples from dreams, others changed laws. A single image seen in the silent hours could shift the lives of thousands. Before great decisions, wars, marriages, harvests, some sought a dream on purpose. They fasted, cleansed, and lay in designated sleep temples, where they waited for a divine message. These dreams were called incubations, and their arrival was not guaranteed. If no dream came, it was accepted as an answer itself. Not yet. The gods are still watching. Not all dreams were from the gods. Some were echoes of the soul's own fears or longings, but even these were not wasted. They were treated like letters the self wrote to itself in the quiet. A dream of falling might reflect doubt. A dream of endless walking might speak of unresolved grief. The dream was always a mirror, but not of the face, of what lay behind the eyes. Dreams could carry healing. A sick person might dream of being touched by a glowing hand, or of drinking from a pool that hummed. Upon waking, they felt stronger, not because the sickness had gone, but because the soul had returned bearing strength. Healing was not always physical. Sometimes it was the simple lifting of despair, a new breath, a morning with purpose. Some dreams lingered all day, clinging to the dreamer like dew. These were called woolen dreams, soft and thick, difficult to shake. They made the dreamer move more slowly, speak less, notice more. It was said these dreams were still unfolding. That part of the soul had not yet returned, still floating between night and waking, finishing its journey. To force a return was to lose something sacred. Better to wait. In the stillest corners of the desert, hermits and seers claimed to live inside their dreams. They spoke little, slept often, and moved as if guided by unseen hands. They were treated not as mad, but as holy. Their dreams, it was said, shaped the paths of stars. They wandered the waking world as dreamers, slipping between realms like sand through open fingers. Some dreams contradicted life. A poor man dreaming he ruled, a criminal dreaming of innocence, a widow dreaming her husband never died. These dreams were not lies, they were possibilities, echoes of other timelines, alternate fates glimpsed through a rip in time. The dream showed what might have been, not to taunt, but to remind that all lives contain multitudes, and even the most fixed fate holds shadowed doors. The dead often visited in dreams. They arrived, not with fanfare, but with familiarity, a gesture, a scent, a shared silence. These dreams were not sad. They brought peace, a confirmation that love endured beyond skin, that bonds stretched past death. Upon waking, the dreamer did not cry. They bowed their head and whispered thanks for having been touched once more by a familiar spirit. Not all remembered their dreams. Some woke with emptiness, a clean slate. This too was sacred. The gods did not always speak. Sometimes they listened. Sometimes the silence was the message, that there was nothing to warn, nothing to change, just rest, just breath, just the quiet holding of space. Over time, certain images returned again and again. A staircase, a voice calling through a reed forest, a door beneath water. These recurring dreams were considered sacred cycles, the gods reminding, reinforcing, circling a truth not yet understood. Each repetition was a deeper ring of understanding, like walking the same temple, but noticing a new glyph each time. And when dawn finally arrived, when the sky blushed and the stars blinked their last, the dream faded, sometimes slowly, like mist, sometimes instantly, like breath drawn too sharply. But it left behind a trail of feeling, an ache, a clarity. The dream did not need to be remembered to be real. It had already done its work. The sleeper rose, stretched, blinked down, the world resumed. But inside, the soul was changed. Just before the sky began to pale, when the world still held the breath of night in its lungs, there came a sliver of time known to the ancients as the lover's hour. It was not measured by sun or stars, but by sensation, a sacred hush between the retreat of dreams and the stirrings of day. In this hour, the world turned inward, and in that stillness, lovers met, but is resting, but hearts awake, tethered, not by touch, but by memory, longing, and a silent flame of breath drawn in. Tandem. The Egyptians did not see love as fleeting passion or sweet possession. Love was power, order, Mat herself flowing between two souls. In the lover's hour, that flow was at its strongest. When voices were silent and the moon stood low, lovers touched not just flesh, but eternity. The night softened the skin, quieted the mind, and opened the space between hearts. Lovers did not always speak. They listened to one another's heartbeat and the silence that wrapped around it. For those who shared a bed, this hour was not meant for sleep. It was the moment the day had not yet claimed, when the world was still malleable. Lovers reached for each other, not always in desire, but in affirmation. A finger trailing down a forearm, a hand resting on a chest, the shared breath warming the space between their lips. In that hour, they reminded each other that their bodies were not mere vessels, but temples where their spirits could kneel and be welcomed. Those parted by walls, by distance, or by death, still felt the hour's pull. A woman lying alone might place a hand on the empty space beside her, knowing her beloved was far away, or buried, or unborn. But still, she breathed as if he lay beside her. She spoke his name into the stillness, not aloud, but within. And in the far reaches of the world, or the deeper layers of spirit, he stirred. For love, the Egyptians believed, was a cord stretched across time and death and silence. Even the gods were lovers, and their stories were told in whispers during the dark. Isis gathering the pieces of Osiris, not arching over Geb, the sky forever, reaching for the earth. Their love shaped the cosmos, and in that sacred hour, mortals followed their divine example. A kiss placed on a lover's shoulder became an echo of a goddess touching her fallen king. A sigh shared in silence became a hymn to the constancy of longing. Lovers in ancient Egypt did not need torches to see each other in the dark. They memorized one another's contours, like cartographers of the sacred body. The curve of a back, the indent of a collarbone, the rhythm of a breath. These were maps of the soul. In the lover's hour, such maps were studied, traced with reverence, as if reading hieroglyphs left by the gods themselves. In this hour, time no longer marched forward, it circled. Two lovers lying together might speak of past lives, not with certainty, but with sensation. I've known this touch before. Your voice lives in my bones. These were not lines of poetry. They were truths the night made visible. And so, wrapped in linen and breath and memory, lovers swam in time's current, briefly and anchored from the present. Those who had no lover did not mourn in this hour. They turned inward, remembering touches long past or hopes yet to bloom. A man might close his eyes and recall a smile, long gone, yet still tender against the edges of his thoughts. A widow might run fingers across her own skin, not in loneliness, but in gratitude for having once been held, and for the chance that love might return again. Sometimes, lovers dreamt of one another, and awoke at the same moment, breathless, and full of knowing. These dreams were not chance. They were meetings, sanctioned by the night. The gods, it was said, allowed lovers to find each other in dreams when the world had pulled them too far apart. And so, eyes opening in tandem across cities or deserts, they smiled, the residue of touch still warming their limbs. There were rituals, too, for this hour. Some lovers braided their hair together, so that even as they turned in sleep, they remained joined. Others bound their wrists loosely with cord, not to constrain, but to symbolize their shared rhythm. These threads were sacred, and in mourning, they were unknotted with prayers, not carelessness. The untying itself was an act of reverence, promise renewed. In some households, love poems were whispered in the dark, not read aloud, but recited, in breath against the skin. The words were not meant for memory. They were meant to sink into the flesh, to be carried in the pause, in the space between heartbeat and sigh. Lovers spoke of each other as gardens, as oases, as rivers where the soul might wash itself clean. No poem was more sacred than the one spoken with lips against ribs. It was said that when two lovers shared the lover's hour without fear or pretense, the gods took notice. They did not interfere, but they lingered. The room warmed slightly, the linens softened, the air shimmered with something unspoken. In these moments, the veil between divine and mortal thinned, and a kiss became a rite, a touch became prayer, and the body itself became altar. Even silence was holy in this hour. Two lovers lying quietly, facing one another, not speaking, not needing. The hush between them was not empty, it was full of stories that didn't need telling, of memories shared without retelling, of futures glimpsed in the twitch of a lip or the flutter of an eyelid. In that stillness, they were not two beings, they were a single flame, dancing in the windless dark. There were mornings when the lover's hour passed unnoticed, when sleep was too deep or burdens too heavy. But even then the hour arrived. It hovered above the bed, waiting, patient. Love, like time, did not demand attention to exist. It simply was. And in these quiet absences, the hour folded itself into the body's memory, returning the next night, again and again, without resentment. For the young, the hour brought excitement, a racing heart, a trembling touch, a sudden awareness of another. For the old, it brought peace, the comfort of breath in tandem, the weight of a familiar arm. Love shifted shape, but never left. The night knew all its forms, and honored each equally. No passion was greater than presence, no heat more lasting than warmth. Some scribes composed secret verses for this hour, never published, never carved. They were kept in hidden scrolls, read only by moonlight, whispered into the neck of a sleeping beloved. These poems bore no names. They belonged to everyone who had ever felt the pull of breath, meeting breath in the stillest corner of the night. In temples, carved deeply in the stone walls, where even torchlight rarely touched, were inscriptions honoring the lover's hour. Not of gods, but of mortals, figures holding hands, eyes meeting beneath stars. The scribes who carved them did so slowly, with tears, for they knew what many forgot, that even in a world of death, taxes, war, and silence, love remained the truest magic, the only miracle that asked for nothing and gave everything. The hour was not reserved only for the well or hall. Those wounded, grieving, broken, they too could offer themselves to love. A touch on a scar, a tear wiped by a thumb, a whispered apology for pain one could not erase. These gestures were not small, they were immense. For in that sacred hour, love was not about perfection, it was about presence, about being seen and not turned away. When the cock crowed and the east began to hum with pale blue, the lovers' hour receded, but its residue lingered. The soft look, the cradled hand, the slow parting of breath. Lovers did not say goodbye. They rose gently, as if stepping away from a sacred pool. The body clothed, the face washed, the heart steadied, but something of the night remained folded behind the ribs. And later, in the sunlit rush of day, when noise returned and duty pressed in, a lover might pause, hands in the grain, eyes on the ledger, and remember a moment, a sigh, a touch that said, "I am with you." And that memory would soften the edges of toil, making the weight of the world a little lighter. For in the darkness, they had loved, and that love had marked the soul like ink upon papyrus. Each night, the lover's hour returns, not always noticed, not always grasped, but always there, waiting. A breath between seconds, a hand reaching in the dark. The gods smile upon it, the stars make room for it, and the world, for just that moment, forgets its spinning. Beneath ceilings painted with stars and walls carved with eternity, the pharaohs slept, not in the careless collapse of common men, but in a posture of purpose. Their rest was ritual, their breath measured, their limbs aligned with the order of the heavens. Even in sleep, they ruled. Their chambers were temples, their pillows sculpted from stone or scented linen, and every fold of cloth that covered them whispered invocations meant not to soothe, but to sustain the weight of divine flesh. For the Egyptians, the pharaoh was not simply a man, he was Horus in life, and Osiris in death. And so, each night, as his eyes closed, he reenacted the great cosmic drama, the descent into the underworld, the battle with chaos, the rising once again. With the sun, to the untrained eye, his body lay still, but the priests knew, his soul traveled through it, guiding the order of the unseen world. His dreams were not personal, they were cosmic. Every vision he received had the power to shape kingdoms. Attendants prepared the pharaoh for sleep with meticulous care. His feet were washed in lotus water, his temples anointed with myrrh. Linen was layered with papyrus strips blessed by temple scribes, inscribed with glyphs of protection. Around him, incense curled like sacred serpents, filling the air with resins that dulled the clamor of mortal life. Silence fell not just in the room, but in the minds of all who entered it. The hour of transition had begun. His bed was not mere furniture, it was an altar, its legs carved into lions or bulls, symbols of power and vigilance. Beneath the frame, sacred sand collected from the banks of holy rivers kept him tethered to earth, while above, a canopy painted with nut, the sky goddess, spread her star-strewn body to cradle him through the long journey. In sleep, the pharaoh did not fall, he ascended. Before closing his eyes, he drank a sacred draught, usually a mixture of blue lotus, honey, and wine infused with prayers. It was said to open the inner eye and relax the physical shell, allowing the ka and ba to separate with ease. He would lie back, arms at his sides, and let the ceremony carry him. To sleep was to surrender, but also to command the unseen. For even the gods watched the slumber of kings. The high priests, meanwhile, took their positions in the hidden chamber adjoining his. They too would not sleep, but would chant in rotations, whispering the names of protective deities, reciting spells from the Book of the Dead, burning amulets of wax shaped in the image of Apophis, the serpent of chaos. The pharaoh's rest was not just rest, it was guarded passage through realms thick with trial and fire. Inside his mind, the pharaoh walked corridors of flame and shadow. He saw the weighing of hearts, the lakes of boiling blood, the hidden gardens where the dead remembered joy. He spoke with ancestors, bargained with gods, and held counsel with the judges of the night. These were not metaphor, these were tasks. The stability of Egypt depended on his successful journey through the unseen, and so, even in his deepest sleep, the pharaoh worked. It was said that the gods sometimes whispered secrets during his slumber, not with voices, but with visions. A crow landing on a pomegranate tree, a pyramid turning into water. These were not dreams, they were commands. Upon waking, the pharaoh might change the calendar, reassign priests, alter the course of temples. No one questioned him, for the night had spoken, and the night knew all. Pharaohs were not allowed to dream freely. Each vision was logged, interpreted, and preserved. Scribes etched his words into palm leaves and gold plates, storing them in dream chambers deep within the temple libraries. These were not read by many. Only the chosen scholars, those trained in dream deep lore, could interpret the messages of divine sleep. And even then, there were always gaps. For some dreams spoke only to the blood of kings. When a pharaoh failed to sleep, when visions did not come, or were filled with confusion and noise, it was seen as an omen. Something was wrong. Perhaps a god had turned away. Perhaps the balance had been broken. In such times, sacrifices were made, temples cleansed, stars remeasured. For if the pharaoh could not dream, then Egypt could not breathe. His rest was the rest of the two lands. But when the sleep was pure, and the visions flowed as the Nile flows, the palace glowed with a subtle light, not from torches, but from harmony. Animals were calm, trees stood still, even the wind softened. The kingdom could feel it, though they did not know why. It was as though the heart of Egypt had beat evenly once more, lulled into peace by the dreaming of its golden sun. In the deepest hour of night, just before the horizon prepared its soft blue blush, the pharaoh's soul returned. Not quickly, not suddenly. It drifted down through veils of clouded meaning, through thresholds guarded by scorpion-headed spirits and lion-limbed gods. His return was like the rising of the sun itself, inevitable, majestic, silent. His fingers twitched, his lips parted, and his body received the weight of itself once again. He did not speak upon waking, not yet. The first hour was for breath, for reflection. He lay still, letting the vision settle, the fire cool. Servants did not rush in. They waited, heads bowed, for the sinner small bell rung by the chamber priest, signaling that the king of Egypt had risen from the night's voyage whole, and bearing the favor of the unseen. When he did speak, his voice was low and distant, as though still hearing things beyond the veil. His words were sparse, but heavy, a gesture, a name, a direction. Each utterance became the law of day. For when a pharaoh dreamed, he did not merely reflect reality, he shaped it. His mind was the vessel of divine will, and his sleep the crucible, in which that will was forged. No one touched the pharaoh during his sleep, not even his beloved. His body was a sanctum, his dreams too potent for mortal interference. If he stirred, it was not to be soothed, it was to be witnessed. Some nights he wept in sleep, other nights he smiled. These signs were recorded and meditated upon by the dream priests, for they, too, were part of the machinery that interpreted the night's gifts. When the pharaoh aged, and sleep became fragile, the rituals intensified. More incense, more chants, greater protection. It was believed that a pharaoh's final sleep, his death, began in his dreams. That the gods came to him in slumber and whispered, "Come now, you have served." And he, recognizing the voice he had known in countless visions, nodded, and slipped away, not with fear, but with familiarity. In tombs, carved beneath sacred cliffs, the walls depicted this sleep, not the agony of death, but the serenity of return. The pharaoh lies with eyes closed, surrounded by stars, watched by gods with open palms. These images were not metaphors, they were memories, for each pharaoh had already seen his own death 100 times in dreams, and had learned to meet it like a long-absent friend. The sleep of the pharaohs was not reserved for kings alone. In smaller, simpler ways, each soul of Egypt reenacted this ritual nightly. A farmer closing his eyes, with a prayer, a child curling into a mother's arms, a weaver listening to the wind before sleep, all, in their own quiet way, stepped into the corridors the pharaohs walked. All tasted a sliver of divine descent and return. Thus, the pharaoh slept, wrapped in silence, carried by scent, guarded by devotion. His was not an escape from waking life, but a passage into deeper service. For as he dreamt, Egypt breathed. As he rested, the Nile remembered its banks, and when he awoke, the sun itself bowed slightly grateful, perhaps, to have not risen alone. The horizon softened, and the stars blinked slowly, one by one, like embers going cold in the sky's great brazier. There was no sound yet from the birds, no whisper from the palms, but the color of the world was changing. From black to the faintest pearl, the sky's hem began to loosen its hold on night. This was the moment known by the old priests, not as the beginning of day, but as the return, the sacred hour, when the soul, having wandered through dreams and divinities, found its way back into the bond temple of the body. Not everyone noticed the exact instant of return. Most simply stirred a leg drawn closer to the chest, a head shifting on cloth, a breath drawn a little deeper. But within that small gesture was a ceremony older than pyramids. The bar and the car, having flown through the corridors of night, slipped into the chest like threads through a needle's eye. It was not loud, it was not light, it was a hum within the ribs, a remembering of shape. In the countryside, a mother awoke with the taste of sleep still on her lips. She did not yet rise, but opened her eyes slowly, sensing the presence of herself, settling back inside. The dream had gone, or perhaps remained in some folded corner of her heart. But the knowing came. Her body was hers again, her breath aligned with earth. She placed a hand on her stomach, not to protect it, but to feel the pulse of return. In the palace, a young servant opened her eyes before the call of her mistress. She'd dreamt of a white ibis flying through reeds, and awoke certain that the god Thoth had whispered some truth to her. Though she could not recall the words, she walked differently that morning, lighter, more attuned. She knew without understanding that her soul had returned with something sacred clutched in its beak. Even the animals sensed it. A cat, curled at the foot of a sleeping child, lifted its head just before dawn and blinked toward the east, not as a guard, but as a witness. It watched the light grow imperceptibly brighter and pressed its body closer to the boy's, sharing the warmth, anchoring the child's soul as it re-entered through his breath. The sun was not yet risen, but its intention could be felt. The wind shifted slightly. The coolness that had settled across clay walls and reeds began to lift. This was the hour when the priests, rising to offer their first incense, moved barefoot in silence. They did not speak until the sun's edge kissed the horizon. Even their silence was prayer, acknowledging the sacredness of return. The body at this time was not yet fully alert. Muscles remembered movement, but did not yet engage it. Thoughts floated, dream thick and soft. It was a twilight between two worlds where one could recall the weightlessness of the spirit, yet feel the pull of gravity. In this space, the Egyptians believed, a person was most porous to meaning, most open to truth. It was when the gods still listened. Fishermen waking by the riverbank did not rush to cast their nets. They first cupped the Nile's water in their palms and held it to their foreheads, not to cleanse, but to reconnect. For as the soul returned to the body, it needed to be reminded of the world it had left behind, a world of skin and soil, of sun and sweat, of hunger and harvest. A father, stirring beside his wife, turned toward her. Though still half asleep, he did not speak. He did not need to. His soul, freshly returned, reached toward hers, and their breath mingled as it had in night's quiet hour. It was not desire, nor even love, it was recognition. To spirits, once again housed in flesh, greeting each other with the silence that comes before language. Children woke more slowly. Their souls, the priests said, were reluctant to return, for they still remembered the taste of starlight, the warmth of gods. A mother brushing hair from her daughter's brow might see her eyes flutter, her lips murmur the names of things unseen. She would not shake her child awake. She would wait, knowing the return was delicate. Like a bird alighting on water dot for the elderly, the return was both joy and sorrow. Each morning felt like a gift unwrapped from the night's long journey. But it was also a reminder that one day the soul might not return, that one night it might pass too far beyond and choose to stay. Still, they smiled at the sunrise, whispered prayers of gratitude, and washed their faces as if anointing themselves with one more dawn. As light crept along thresholds and touched the tips of palm fronds, voices returned to the world, first in whispers, then in greetings, in laughter, in argument. The silence of night cracked open, and life poured out like honey from a tilted jar. But beneath the clamor, the return still echoed in every motion, every gesture. A memory of having been elsewhere. A woman stepping outside to sweep her doorway paused, not because she was tired, but because she felt the final flutter of a bar settling behind her heart. She looked at the pink sky, blinked, and nodded once to no one, to everything. That gesture sealed the return. Her day could begin, now that all her pieces were home. At temples, offerings were laid, not only to the gods but to the soul itself for completing its nightly flight and returning safely. Bread, beer, and dates were placed near family altars, not as meals, but as thank-you offerings to the self that had dared to fly and return. The act reminded all that sleep was not unconsciousness, but pilgrimage. As the sun finally breached the horizon, its light did not erase the night it gilded it. The memories of dreams, of shadowed journeys, were not discarded but woven into the day. A dream of a snake might become a decision not to travel. A vision of a grandmother's voice might inspire a recipe revived. The soul's messages did not fade. They rooted themselves quietly beneath the surface. Artisans and scribes, rising with the light, did not rush to their tools. Some sat briefly in the courtyard, eyes closed, heads bowed, not in sleep, but in reflection. They asked themselves, "What did I bring back with me?" And though no words answered, they felt it in the stillness behind the eyes, the calm in the chest, the clarity of their fingers. The return was complete. The children, now fully awake, ran barefoot through sand and shadow, laughing with spirits too large for their limbs. They did not know they had just crossed a great divide, but their joy was evidence. They were whole. Their souls had returned, gleaming like coins beneath their ribs, stamped again with the seal of divine favor. In the great city's market, as stalls opened and hands passed clay jugs from palm to palm, even commerce bore the echo of return. People looked one another in the eye, not as strangers, but as survivors of a night they'd each traveled alone. A nod, a smile, a jokel, small rituals of welcome. For in returning to the world, they also returned to each other. The priests, who had remained awake through the dark, now closed their eyes not to sleep, but to touch the silence inside themselves. Theirs was a different return, not of soul to body, but of vigilance to surrender. As the world began to spin again, they let themselves be still, for their task was done. The pharaoh had risen, the people had stirred, the gods had been honored, the sun had kept its promise, and so, the day began not as a sudden arrival, but as a slow, sacred return, one soul at a time, like stars retreating behind a pale blue curtain. And behind every movement, every conversation, every sip of water, or step upon the earth, there lingered the memory of that sacred flight through nighthand, the tender, triumphant return at dawn.